the depth of an eye socket, the pale fire of hair that burns red under northern light, the silence behind the eyes that seems to hold memories too old for any living language to name. These are not small differences. These are not the kind of variations you'd expect between neighboring populations who have shared a continent for 10,000 years. These are deeper, stranger, almost inexplicable, and the deeper you go, the more unsettling the story becomes. If you're watching this to fall asleep, that's exactly why I make these videos. Maybe subscribe and let me know where are you right now and what time is it. Picture yourself standing on the coast of the Outer Hebrides on a grey morning in late autumn. The sea is the colour of old iron. The wind comes at you sideways, carrying salt and something older than salt, something mineral and cold and faintly electric. The smell of a world that has been arranging itself for a very long time without asking anyone's permission. The cliffs behind you are not gentle. They are not the rolling chalk faces you would find in southern England or the sandy bluffs along the coast of France. These are ancient things, black and fractured, and worn to a kind of brutal patience by tens of thousands of years of Atlantic storm. The rock under your feet, if you were to have it dated, would come back with numbers that stagger the mind. Some of the oldest surface rock anywhere on the planet. Lewisian gneiss formed nearly 3 billion years ago, give or take a few hundred million. 3 billion. When that rock was already old, the rest of what we now call Europe was not yet assembled into anything recognizable. And the people who live here, the people who have lived here, in one form or another since the ice retreated, they carry something in their faces that the rock seems to carry too, a kind of antiquity, a kind of patient, wind-carved distance from whatever the rest of the world has been doing. Modern genetics has given us tools that would have seemed miraculous to previous generations. We can now look inside living people and read their ancestry going back tens of thousands of years. We can compare populations across continents and measure, with extraordinary precision, how close or how distant they are. And when researchers began applying these tools to the populations of the Scottish Islands, particularly the Western Isles, the Shetland archipelago, and the remoter communities of the Highland Atlantic fringe, what they found did not fit neatly into any existing model. These people were different, not slightly, not within the range of expected variation between neighbouring populations. They were measurably, reproducibly, genetically distinct from other Europeans in ways that pointed somewhere deeper in time than the last few thousand years of recorded history. Their ancestry signature carried traces of something ancient, something that predated the great agricultural migrations that reshaped the continent between 5,000 and 8,000 years ago, something that had been diluted almost everywhere else but had survived, in fragments, in pockets, in isolated islands and mountain communities along the Atlantic edge. The question that immediately follows is the obvious one. Why here? Why did this ancient ancestral signature survive so much more completely in the Scottish Islands than it did in, say, France or Spain or Germany or anywhere else on the continent? What happened on these islands? What combination of geography and history and sheer stubborn isolation that allowed a genetic echo from a world before farming, before metal, before the first cities of Mesopotamia, to persist into the present day? Those questions do not have simple answers. They never do when you are dealing with the deep past. But the trail they lead you down is one of the most compelling and least understood stories in all of human prehistory. It is a story that involves ancient populations we barely have names for, migrations that crossed entire continents, a catastrophic flooding event that reshaped the northwestern edge of Europe, the rise and fall of civilizations that left no writing behind, and a mystery sitting at the bottom of the North Sea that most people have never heard of. It is a story about who we are before we were who we think we are. Let us begin at the beginning. Not the beginning of Scottish history, not the beginning of recorded European history, but the actual beginning. The point, roughly 15,000 years ago, when the most recent ice age was retreating and the first humans were cautiously following it northward into landscapes that had been buried under glaciers for tens of thousands of years. The British Isles, as we know them, did not exist at that time. What is now England, Scotland, Ireland, and Wales was not a collection of islands. It was a peninsula, a cold, windswept extension of the northwestern European landmass connected to what is now Holland and Germany and Denmark by a vast plain of grassland and marsh and braided river systems. Archaeologists and geologists who have studied this lost landscape call it Doggerland, named after the Dogger Bank, the shallow submarine ridge in the North Sea, where trawler nets sometimes still pull up the bones of ancient animals and, very occasionally, the tools of ancient people. Doggerland was not a desolate waste. In its heyday, roughly between 10,000 and 8,000 years ago, it was a rich and productive landscape. Deer herds, wild cattle, boar, beaver, otter, and fish in enormous abundance. The rivers that crossed it would have been among the largest in northwestern Europe, fed by meltwater from the retreating glaciers and draining an interior that stretched from what is now Scotland all the way to the Rhine. There were forests along the riverbanks and open grassland further inland. There were marshes rich with waterfowl and reeds. There were lakes and estuaries and long sandy spits where seals hauled out and seabirds nested in their millions. And there were people. Mesolithic people, what we call hunter-gatherers, but what were in fact highly sophisticated foragers with complex technologies, extensive social networks, and knowledge of their landscape that modern ecologists would spend careers trying to replicate. These were not cavemen. These were not brutes dragging clubs through the undergrowth. These were people with finely made tools of flint and antler and bone, people who knew the tides and the fish runs and the migration patterns of every large animal in their territory, people who had names for the stars and stories about the world that went back further than any memory could reach. These people are our missing piece. These are the ones whose genetic signature is still detectable, faintly, in the populations of the Scottish Islands. And to understand why it survived there and almost nowhere else, we have to understand what happened to Doggerland. What happened to Doggerland was among the most catastrophic environmental events in all of human prehistory in this part of the world. And it happened in a way that was both gradual and sudden, both inevitable and, for the people living through it, almost certainly incomprehensible. The gradual part had been going on for thousands of years. As the glaciers of the last ice age retreated, the water they had locked up began returning to the oceans. Sea levels were rising, not dramatically, not day by day in any way that an individual human could perceive, but over generations and centuries, the lower-lying portions of Doggerland were slowly inundated. The coastlines crept inward. Islands appeared where there had been hills. Rivers that had once emptied into broad estuaries now emptied into the open sea. The world was shrinking. Then came the sudden part. Roughly 8,200 years ago, give or take a few decades, something happened off the coast of what is now Norway. A massive section of the seafloor, a submarine landslide that geologists call the Storegga Slide, collapsed into the depths of the Atlantic. The volume of sediment involved was almost beyond comprehension. The slide released somewhere between 2,000 and 3,000 cubic kilometers of material into the ocean in what was probably a matter of hours. The displacement of that much water generated a tsunami, or more accurately, a series of tsunamis, that travelled across the North Sea at enormous speed. The wave that struck Doggerland would have been unlike anything the people living there had ever experienced or imagined. Modern modelling suggests it could have reached 10 metres in height in some places, perhaps more in coastal areas where topography would have funneled and amplified it. For a landscape that was already low-lying and partially flooded, already reduced to a shrinking archipelago of higher ground, surrounded by shallow sea, a 10-metre wave was not a disaster from which you recovered. It was an erasure. Whatever remained of Doggerland above sea level after the Storegga tsunami was, within a few more centuries of continued sea level rise, gone entirely. The last islands disappeared beneath the surface of what we now call the North Sea sometime around 6,000 years ago. The people who had lived on them were gone too, absorbed into other populations, driven inland and northward, pressed against the rising water from behind and the new coastlines from in front. But here is where the story gets interesting. Some of them made it. Some of those Mesolithic hunter-gatherers, those ancient Atlantic Europeans with their deep ancestral roots in a landscape that no longer exists, reached the higher ground and survived. And the highest ground, the most defensible against the rising sea, the places that would always remain land no matter how many meters the ocean climbed, were the rocky islands and peninsulas of what we now call Scotland's Atlantic fringe. The Outer Hebrides, Orkney, Shetland, the rocky western coast of the Scottish mainland. These were the places the water could not reach. These were the places where the last Doggerlanders found refuge. And they were not alone for long, Because even as the catastrophe was unfolding, even as Doggerland was drowning, something else was happening in the south and east. A different kind of wave was moving across Europe. Not water, people, the first farmers. The agricultural revolution is one of the most discussed and least understood transitions in all of human history. It began in the Near East, in the fertile crescent of what is now Iraq and Syria and Turkey and Israel, somewhere around 10 to 12,000 years ago. People there began doing something that no human beings had ever done before on any meaningful scale. They began growing their food rather than finding it. They began tending animals rather than hunting them. They began staying in one place rather than following the rhythms of the seasons and the migrations of wild herds. The reasons why this happened, why it happened when it happened, and where it happened, are still genuinely debated among archaeologists and paleoanthropologists. What is less debated is what happened next. The farming lifestyle, whatever its origins, turned out to be extraordinarily successful at producing more people. A population that grows its own food can, under the right conditions, support many more individuals per square kilometre than a population that forages. And more individuals means more children. And more children, over generations and centuries, means expansion. The farmers expanded. Slowly at first, then faster. Generation by generation, family by family, they moved out of the Near East and into Europe. By 8,000 years ago, they had reached the Balkans. By 7,000, they were in Central Europe. By 6,000, they were in France and the Iberian Peninsula. By 5,500 years ago, they were at the edge of what is now Scotland. These early European farmers, as geneticists call them, were physically and genetically distinct from the Mesolithic hunter-gatherers they encountered along the way. They were shorter, darker, with different cranial shapes and different immune system profiles, tuned to different environments. They brought with them not just farming techniques but new material cultures, new pottery traditions, new building styles, and new genetic variants that would, over the following millennia, come to dominate the European gene pool. Where the two groups, the ancient hunters and the new farmers, met and mixed, the hunters were gradually absorbed. Their genes did not disappear entirely. They survive in modern Europeans as what geneticists call the Western hunter-gatherer or WHG component. But in most of Europe, they survive only as a minority fraction, 10% here, 15% there, a ghostly remnant of the people who were there first. In the Scottish Islands, something different happened. The farmers reached Britain, and they reached Scotland. But the farther north and west they went, the more difficult the terrain became. The Atlantic fringe was not prime farmland. The soils on the Hebridean Islands were thin and acidic. The weather was harsh and unpredictable. The growing seasons were short. The islands themselves were not easy to reach by the kinds of small boats that the early farming communities used. They were, in short, not the most attractive prospect for agricultural settlers looking to establish themselves. The Mesolithic populations who had retreated there from the drowning of Doggerland had, inadvertently, found themselves in one of the few places in all of northwestern Europe where geography was going to protect them from the demographic tsunami of the farming revolution. Not completely, not forever. The farmers came eventually. The archaeology tells us that megalithic monuments began appearing on the Scottish Islands around 5,000 years ago, structures that bear the unmistakable fingerprint of farming cultures spreading along the Atlantic coastline. The great stone circles of Lewis and Harris, the chambered cairns of Orkney, the brocks and duns and hut circles that dot the landscape of the Outer Hebrides. These are not Mesolithic structures. They were built by people who farmed, who kept cattle and sheep, who knew how to work stone on a monumental scale. But the crucial question is what happened to the Mesolithic people who were already there when the farmers arrived. And the genetic evidence, the DNA extracted from ancient bones found in Scottish island contexts and compared to modern populations, suggests that in this particular corner of Europe, the mixing was more balanced than it was elsewhere. The ancient hunters were not simply replaced, they mixed. Their genetic legacy was preserved in a higher proportion than almost anywhere else on the continent. Why? Possibly because the farming population that reached the Scottish Islands was itself relatively small. You do not send your largest and most vigorous communities to conquer a rocky Atlantic archipelago when there is perfectly good farmland available further south. The settlers who made the journey north and west were, most likely, smaller in number than the communities they would have encountered in more accessible parts of Europe. And smaller settler populations mean less genetic displacement of whatever indigenous people were already there. But the farmers were not the last group to leave a significant genetic imprint on European populations. There was a third wave, and in some ways, it was the most dramatic of all. Starting around 5,000 years ago, a population from the Pontic-Caspian steppe, the vast grasslands north of the Black Sea and Caspian Sea in what is now Ukraine and Russia, began expanding westward with a speed and thoroughness that still astonishes researchers who study it. These were the people geneticists call the Yamnaya, named after an archaeological culture identified by their distinctive burial pits. They were pastoralists, herders of cattle and sheep and horses. They were, almost certainly, early speakers of Proto-Indo-European, the ancestral language from which virtually all of Europe's modern tongues would eventually descend. And they were, by any measure, extraordinarily successful. Within a few centuries of the Yamnaya expansion beginning, their genetic signature appears across enormous swaths of Europe. In some regions of Central and Northern Europe, the Yamnaya-related ancestry component approaches 50 or even 60% of the modern population's genome. The speed of this genetic transformation is, frankly, staggering. Some researchers who study it compare it to a replacement rather than a migration. The farming cultures that had dominated Europe for thousands of years were, in many regions, substantially displaced. But once again, the Atlantic fringe proved resistant. The Yamnaya and their descendants spread most successfully across the open plains and grasslands of northern and central Europe. These were landscapes that suited their pastoral, mobile lifestyle. The mountainous terrain of Iberia slowed them somewhat. The densely forested Atlantic coast of France offered more resistance. And Scotland's island communities, already twice removed from the main currents of continental migration, already inhabited by a population with deep local roots and a geography that made mass demographic disruption difficult, absorbed the Yamnaya influence more slowly and in lower proportions than most of Europe. What this means, in practical genetic terms, is that the modern people of the Scottish Islands carry a triple-layered ancestry, unlike almost anyone else in Europe. They have a significant component, higher than almost any comparable population on the continent, of that ancient Mesolithic hunter-gatherer ancestry, the genetic legacy of the people who lived on and around Doggerland before it drowned. They have a farming component from the Neolithic agricultural expansion, but often a smaller proportion than populations in southern and eastern Europe. And they have a Yamnaya-related steppe ancestry component, but again, often in lower proportion than many of their continental contemporaries. This triple layering, with its unusually high ancient hunter-gatherer base, is the genetic source of the distinctiveness that researchers observe. It is not a single dramatic difference. It is an accumulation, a palimpsest of ancestry written in layers, each one representing a different chapter in the story of human movement across this corner of the world. And it shows up not just in the abstract mathematics of population genetics, but in visible, measurable physical traits. The cranial morphology of island Scottish populations, the shape and proportions of their skulls, differs measurably from most other European populations in ways that researchers have documented for well over a century, long before modern genetics gave them the tools to understand why. The prevalence of certain eye colors, certain hair textures, certain facial bone structures. These are not random, they are echoes. But there is another layer to this story, one that sits between the ancient hunters and the Yamnaya expansion, one that is only now beginning to be understood with any clarity. It concerns the people who built the great megalithic monuments scattered along the entire Atlantic coast of Europe, from Portugal and southern Spain in the south, all the way to Scotland and Scandinavia in the north. These monuments, stone circles, long barrows, dolmens, passage tombs, standing stones, are among the most dramatic physical evidence of prehistoric human activity anywhere in the world. Stonehenge is the most famous, but it is far from unique. There are tens of thousands of megalithic structures along the European Atlantic seaboard, ranging from simple standing stones to extraordinarily complex architectural achievements that required the organized labor of large communities and intimate knowledge of astronomy. For a long time, Researchers assumed these monuments reflected a single cultural tradition spreading along the Atlantic coast from a single point of origin. The idea was that the knowledge of how to build these structures, and perhaps the religious or ceremonial impulses that motivated their construction, spread from one community to another through trade and contact, the way technological innovations spread today. But the genetic evidence tells a more complicated and more remarkable story. The people who built these monuments from Portugal to Scotland were not just sharing cultural ideas, they were, to a significant degree, sharing ancestry. A genetic analysis of ancient remains from megalithic burial sites across the Atlantic arc of Europe reveals that these communities were more closely related to each other than they were to contemporary populations living just a few hundred kilometers inland. In other words, there was a distinct Atlantic coastal population, a people who moved along the seaways of the European Atlantic fringe and maintained genetic and cultural connections across what seem, from a land-based perspective, like enormous distances. They shared not just building traditions and astronomical knowledge, but blood. They were, in some meaningful sense, a single extended network of communities stretched along 4,000 kilometers of coastline, and Scotland's island communities were among the northernmost expressions of this Atlantic network. The Orkney Islands, in particular, were a remarkable centre of this megalithic Atlantic culture. The concentration of Neolithic monuments on Orkney is extraordinary, out of all proportion to the island's size or apparent resources. There is Maeshowe, a chambered cairn so precisely aligned with the midwinter solstice that the setting sun illuminates the inner chamber for only a few weeks each year. There is the Ring of Brodgar, a massive stone circle that once contained 60 or more standing stones, arranged with an astronomical precision that has still not been fully deciphered. There is the Stones of Stenness, another stone circle that predates Stonehenge by at least 500 years. And there is Skara Brae, a Neolithic village buried under sand dunes for millennia and preserved so completely that the stone furniture, the beds and dressers and hearths, is still intact. Orkney, in the late Neolithic period, was not a remote backwater. It was a cultural and ceremonial centre whose influence radiated southward, contributing ideas and techniques to the megalithic building traditions of mainland Britain and beyond. The people who built these structures were not isolated primitives. They were sophisticated architects, astronomers, and ceremonial specialists with connections that stretched across the entire Atlantic world. And they were, genetically, the descendants of that ancient mixture of Mesolithic hunters and early farmers that we have been tracing through this story. The people who built Maeshowe and Skara Brae carried, in their DNA, the genetic legacy of the people who had fled the drowning of Doggerland and found refuge on these northern islands. They were the inheritors of an ancestry that went back, in an unbroken line, to the earliest human inhabitants of this landscape. This is why the Scottish Islands are different, not just because of recent history, not just because of clan systems and linguistic isolation and the particular harshness of Atlantic weather that kept outside influences at bay, but because they sit at the end of a genetic thread that runs all the way back to the beginning of human presence in this part of the world, a thread that has been broken and knotted and frayed in most places but survives, more intact than almost anywhere else, in the people of the Outer Islands. It is worth pausing here to consider a parallel that illuminates the Scottish island story by comparison. In the mountains of northern Spain and southern France, straddling the Western Pyrenees, there is a people who have been puzzling European scientists and historians for as long as European scientists and historians have been puzzling about things. The Basques. Their language, Euskara, is famously unrelated to any other known language in the world. It is not a member of the Indo-European family. It is not related to the Semitic languages of the Middle East. It stands alone, a linguistic island in a sea of languages that all descended from a common ancestor spoken on the Pontic steppe 5,000 years ago. For a long time, the Basques were seen as curiosities. Their language isolation was attributed to geographic isolation. Their mountains had kept them separate, simple enough. But modern genetics revealed something far more interesting. The Basques are genetically unusual in exactly the same direction as the Scottish island populations. They have elevated levels of Western hunter-gatherer ancestry. They have lower than average steppe ancestry. They carry, in their DNA, a disproportionately large share of the genetic legacy of the ancient pre-farming populations of Europe. The connection is not coincidental. It reflects the same underlying dynamic, Atlantic and Highland refugia, where geography provided protection from the demographic waves that swept across the rest of the continent. The Basque Mountains served the same function that the Scottish Islands served, a protective enclosure where ancient genetic patterns could persist while the world around them was being transformed. But there is something else the two populations share that is even more striking. Both Basque communities and Scottish island communities have unusually high frequencies of AH-negative blood. The Basques have the highest AH-negative frequencies of any population on Earth, reaching above 30% in some communities. Scottish island populations, while not quite at those extremes, have significantly elevated Rh-negative frequencies compared to most of Europe. This is not a coincidence either. The Rh-negative blood type variant is part of the ancient genetic legacy of these Western hunter-gatherer populations. It was present in the people who lived on and around Doggerland. It was present in the Atlantic megalith builders. It persists today in the populations that carry the highest proportions of that ancient ancestry. It is, in a very real sense, a blood-borne marker of the Doggerlanders. When a Scottish Islander donates blood, and the blood bank records them as R-negative, they are, without knowing it, carrying a small biological reminder of a world that drowned 8,000 years ago. Physical anthropology has a long and complicated history, one that includes dark chapters of misuse in the service of racial ideology, that we would do well to remember, even as we use its methods for legitimate inquiry. But stripped of its historical misuse and applied carefully and in context, the study of skeletal variation across human populations tells stories that no other evidence can. The skeletal remains of ancient populations from the Scottish Islands and the broader Atlantic fringe show a distinctive morphological pattern. Researchers who study craniometrics, the measurement of skull dimensions, have noted for well over a century that Atlantic fringe populations show measurable differences from their continental contemporaries. Longer skulls, measured front to back. Different orbital shapes, the openings in the skull, where the eyes sit, particular proportions of the cheekbones and the brow ridges that set these populations apart from those who descended more exclusively from the Neolithic farmers or the Yamnaya pastoralists. These are not large differences. They are not the kind of differences that a casual observer would notice on the street, but they are statistically consistent and reproducible, and they have been noted independently by researchers working in different countries and different centuries, which gives them a robustness that pure anecdote cannot. What are they measuring when they measure these differences? They are, in essence, measuring time. The particular combination of cranial features that distinguishes Atlantic fringe populations from most other Europeans is not a random variation. It reflects the genetic heritage of the Mesolithic hunter-gatherer populations who were the first inhabitants of this landscape. The Western hunter-gatherers, as the genetic literature calls them, had a distinctive physical type that differed from both the early European farmers and the Yamnaya pastoralists who followed them. That physical type was, by and large, replaced across most of Europe as the later waves of migration brought new ancestry and new physical patterns. But at the edge of the Atlantic, in the islands and peninsulas that the great migrations barely reached, something of it survived. Modern Scots from the island communities, when their skulls are measured against the skulls of ancient Mesolithic hunter-gatherers from Britain, show statistically higher similarity than modern populations from most other parts of Europe. They are, in a measurable physical sense, closer to their Mesolithic ancestors than any other living European population. This finding has been replicated using modern facial reconstruction techniques applied to ancient skulls. When researchers reconstruct what the Mesolithic inhabitants of Britain looked like, they produce faces that, while not identical to any modern person, bear recognizable resemblances to the population types still found in the Scottish Islands and the broader Atlantic fringe. The particular combination of brow ridge, depth, orbital shape, and cheekbone prominence that emerges from those ancient reconstructions is not unfamiliar to anyone who has spent time among the people of the Outer Hebrides or the Northern Isles. We are looking, through the distorting lens of time and mixture and change, at ourselves as we were before history. But the physical legacy of the ancient Atlantic populations is not limited to bone structure. There are subtler physiological patterns that researchers have begun to document. The population genetics literature notes that Atlantic fringe populations have distinct profiles when it comes to certain disease susceptibilities and resistances. They have elevated frequencies of genetic variance associated with efficient processing of marine-based diets, which makes evolutionary sense for people whose ancestors spent thousands of years living primarily on fish and shellfish along what were then the most productive coastlines in Europe. They have particular immune system profiles that differ from continental populations in ways that may reflect the distinct pathogen environments of the Atlantic coast. And there are the eyes, the peculiar, pale, sometimes almost luminous eyes that have been noted by observers for centuries. Blue eyes, green eyes, hazel eyes that shift color with the light, grey eyes with a clarity that seems to look through rather than at. Eye color is genetically complex, controlled by multiple genes that interact in ways researchers are still fully characterizing. But the overall pattern of light pigmentation in eyes and skin and hair that characterizes Atlantic fringe populations is, like everything else we have discussed, an echo of the ancient populations who were here first. The Western hunter-gatherers of Mesolithic Europe were based on the genetic evidence we now have from ancient DNA, likely lighter-eyed than the early European farmers who followed them. The farmers, arriving from the Near East, would have carried a genetic background that typically produces darker pigmentation. The Yamnaya, who came later, were a mixed picture. But the ancient hunters of the Atlantic coast, the people of Doggerland and its margins, were probably more lightly pigmented than the populations that would partly displace them. When that ancient genetic background survived most completely, in the islands and peninsulas of the Atlantic fringe, the pale eyes survived with it. The eyes of a Hebridean fisherman, looking out across water the color of pewter on a November afternoon, maybe looking through lenses inherited from someone who watched the same water rise, slowly and then catastrophically, 8,000 years ago. There is a tradition that runs through the folklore of the Scottish Islands, and of Ireland, and of the Norse communities that settled both, that is unlike any other mythological tradition in Northern Europe. It concerns beings called Selkies, seal people, creatures that can shed their seal skins and walk on land in human form, beings that are not quite human and not quite animal, that belong to both the land and the sea, and are fully at home in neither. The Selkie tradition is specific to the Atlantic fringe. You do not find it in the folklore of Central Europe, or in the myths of the continental Germanic peoples, or in the traditions of Southern Europe. It exists in the places where the sea is always present, always audible, always just over the next hill or at the bottom of the next cliff. It exists in the places where people have been living in intimate relationship with the Atlantic for longer than almost anyone else on Earth. Folklorists have catalogued hundreds of Selkie stories from the Scottish Islands alone. Some of them are heartbreaking. The Selkie woman who comes ashore falls in love with a human man, loses her sealskin, and is trapped on land, always yearning for the water she cannot return to. Some are darker. The Selkie men who come ashore and seduce human women, leaving behind children with webbed fingers and an inexplicable pull toward the sea. Some are simply mysterious. The places where, if you go at certain times of year, you can hear the seal song, the music that the Selkies make when they think no one is listening. What does this tradition encode? Where does it come from? One possibility that researchers have explored, carefully and with appropriate skepticism, is that the Selkie tradition is a very old cultural memory. Not a memory of literal seal people, of course, but a memory of a time when there were different kinds of people, when the sea people and the land people were genuinely distinct communities with different ways of life, and perhaps, in living memory of some long-ago storyteller, visibly different appearances. Consider what the coastlines of northwestern Britain looked like in the period just before and just after the farming revolution arrived. There were, living along those coasts, the last communities of Mesolithic hunter-gatherers, people who had been living from the sea for thousands of years, who were expert fishermen and shellfish gatherers and seal hunters, who built their shelters on the shore, and whose entire way of life was organized around the rhythms of the tidal world. These were people who, as we have established, looked somewhat different from the farmers who were beginning to arrive from the south and east. Different bone structure, possibly different skin and eye coloration, different stature, different material culture, speaking languages that were utterly unlike the early farming community's speech. When the farmers encountered these coastal people, what did they see? People who seemed to emerge from the sea, people who lived on seashore and ate seal and whale and fish, People who could navigate the most dangerous waters in the world as casually as the farmers walked their fields. People who were, in some ways that the farmers could see and feel but perhaps not articulate, different. Is it impossible that a cultural memory of that encounter, heavily mythologized across thousands of years of retelling, is embedded in the Selkie tradition? That the Seal people of Hebridean legend are, at the deepest level, a folk memory of the sea people who were already here when the farmers came, the last inhabitants of a world that was already drowning, even as the new settlers arrived to plant their first fields? This is speculation. It is explicitly speculative. But it is not empty speculation. The deep time folk memory hypothesis has been taken seriously by researchers in other contexts. The Aboriginal Australian oral traditions of flooding events that match geological evidence of post-glacial sea level rise have been documented and validated. The Scandinavian legends of Ragnarok have elements that some researchers connect to genuine memories of the volcanic winters and climate disruptions of the first millennium. Memory, encoded in story, compressed and transformed over millennia, is not as fragile as we tend to assume. Cultures that depend on oral transmission have developed extraordinary techniques for preserving the essential core of information, even as the surface details change. The people of the Scottish Islands have been telling stories about beings who come from the sea for as long as anyone can trace their oral traditions. Perhaps they are telling a story about themselves. Here is a name that appears in the historical record and then, with unsettling abruptness, disappears from it. The Picts. The Picts were the dominant population of northern and northeastern Scotland in the early historic period, from roughly the 3rd century AD to the 9th or 10th century. The Romans encountered them at the northern edge of Hadrian's Wall, the massive fortification that marked the empire's effective frontier in Britain, and wrote about them with a mixture of fear and bewilderment. The name Picti, meaning painted or tattooed people, was a Roman label. We do not know what they called themselves. What we know about the Picts is fragmentary, frustrating, and in many respects deeply puzzling. They left behind an extraordinarily rich artistic tradition carved in stone, symbol stones scattered across northeastern Scotland and the Northern Isles bearing images and designs unlike anything found in the art of any neighbouring culture. Elaborate interlace patterns, stylized animals, mysterious geometric symbols that have defied decades of attempts at interpretation, crescents and V-rods, double discs with Z-rods, mirror symbols, comb symbols, beasts drawn with a flowing naturalism that is breathtaking even to modern eyes, and a language. The Picts spoke a language, or possibly two languages, that has only partly survived in inscriptions carved on some of those same stones, in place names scattered across the landscape of northern Scotland, and in occasional Latin mentions in early medieval texts. The linguistic identity of the Pictish language or languages has been debated for well over a century. Most researchers now believe that at least one form of Pictish was a Brittonic Celtic language related to Welsh and Cornish, and the other P-Celtic tongues of Britain. But there are elements in the Pictish inscriptions that do not fit comfortably into any Celtic framework, that seem to belong to something older, something that was there before the Celtic languages arrived in Britain. Could there be a connection between the enigmatic, non-Celtic elements of the Pictish inscriptions and the ancient pre-farming population whose genetic legacy we have been tracing? It is not impossible. The linguistic situation in Britain before the arrival of Celtic languages is, frankly, unknown. The Celtic languages spread into Britain sometime in the Bronze Age or early Iron Age, replacing whatever was spoken before. What was spoken before is a blank. We have no documentation of it, no texts, no extended inscriptions. We have only absence. The absence, in some respects, is interesting. The pre-Celtic linguistic layer of Britain, if it existed as a distinct entity rather than simply being an ancestor of the Celtic tongues, would have been spoken most persistently in the same places where the ancient genetic patterns survived most completely. The remote north and west, the islands, the places geography protected. If language follows genetic patterns the way it often does, then the Pictish non-Celtic elements, those puzzling inscriptions that researchers cannot fit into any known linguistic framework, might be the last traces of a language spoken on the shores of Doggerland 8,000 years before anyone was writing anything down. This is a speculative bridge. No linguist has established this connection with any rigor, but it is a bridge that some researchers have found worth exploring, precisely because the alternative, assuming that the linguistic slate was simply wiped clean by the Celtic arrivals and that nothing of what came before survives, seems like it might be underestimating the resilience of the human impulse to pass things on. The Picts themselves disappear from the historical record after the formation of the Kingdom of Scotland in the 9th century. They do not disappear genetically. Their descendants are the people of northeastern Scotland and the Northern Isles, people who today speak English or Scots, but carry in their DNA and their faces and the particular cast of their expressions something that was there long before any of those languages were dreamed of. No story of the Scottish Islands is complete without the Norse. The Vikings arrived in the northern and western Isles of Scotland beginning in the late 8th century, and their impact was transformative. They settled in enormous numbers, replacing or assimilating the existing populations in many island communities to a degree that has few parallels in other parts of Britain. The evidence for this is linguistic. The Norn language, a North Germanic tongue derived from Old Norse, was spoken in Orkney until the 18th century and in Shetland well into the 19th. The place names of both archipelagos are overwhelmingly Norse. Virtually every settlement name in Shetland, and most in Orkney, comes from Old Norse roots. Genetically, the Norse impact was also substantial. Studies of Y chromosome ancestry in the Northern Isles show that a significant proportion of the paternal lineages in both Shetland and Orkney derive from Scandinavian sources. Some estimates suggest that Norse-derived paternal ancestry in Shetland may approach 60%, though the maternal lineages tell a different and more mixed story. And yet, the ancient pre-Norse ancestry, the deep Mesolithic and Neolithic Atlantic background that we have been tracing, was not eliminated. It persisted. When researchers look at the full genome of modern Shetland and Orkney populations, not just the paternal Y chromosome but the entire ancestral picture, they find both the Norse contribution and the older layer underneath it. The ancient Atlantic ancestry that the Norse settlers encountered when they arrived, that was already there in the communities they displaced or absorbed, survived in the female lineages and in the autosomes, the non-sex chromosomes that make up the vast majority of the human genome. What this means is that the Norse settlement, dramatic as it was not a complete replacement, it was a layering. The island populations of today carry Norse ancestry on top of an older foundation that has never been entirely erased. The combination produces something unique, a population that has the geographical and cultural Scandinavian influence of the Norse period, laid over an ancient Atlantic genetic substrate that goes back, in unbroken continuity, to before any of those Scandinavian people's own ancestors had left the Pontic steppe. There is something almost geological about this. The island populations of Scotland have been accumulating ancestral layers the way the landscape accumulates strata, the Mesolithic hunters at the base, the Atlantic megalith building farmers above them, the Norse settlers above that, later influences Scottish, English and otherwise, making up the most recent deposit. But unlike sedimentary rock, where the lower layers are buried and invisible, all these genetic strata are present simultaneously in every living cell of every modern islander. They are all there at once, not sequential but simultaneous, a living archive of 10,000 years of human presence in one of the most remote and challenging environments in Europe. The Norse period did something else that is worth noting. It reinforced the maritime character of the island communities. The Norse were among the most skilled seafarers the world has ever produced. Their ability to navigate the open Atlantic in wooden longships without any of the navigational instruments that modern sailors take for granted was extraordinary. When they settled in Orkney and Shetland, they brought that seafaring culture with them and layered it on top of communities that already had deep maritime traditions going back to the Mesolithic. The result was island societies that were, for centuries, among the most accomplished mariners in the North Atlantic. The Shetland fishing traditions that persisted well into the 20th century, the open boat half fishing that took small crews far out into the Atlantic after cod and ling, were direct, cultural descendants of the Viking Age seafaring. But underneath that Norse-derived fishing culture was an even older substrate, the knowledge of the sea that the ancient Atlantic communities had accumulated over millennia of living from it. Two seafaring traditions, centuries and genetics apart, superimposed on the same islands and expressed by the same people. There is a principle in population genetics called genetic drift. In a large population, random variations in who reproduces successfully tend to average out over time. But in a small, isolated population, random events can have enormous effects. If, purely by chance, the individuals who happen to reproduce most successfully in a small community are those who carry a particular genetic variant, that variant can increase in frequency much faster than it would in a larger population. The mathematical models are clear on this. Small, isolated populations are where genetic variation concentrates, where unusual combinations of ancestry are preserved, where the ancient and the anomalous survive longest. The Scottish island communities, for most of their history, were about as isolated as European populations got, not completely isolated. They traded, they occasionally intermarried with mainland Scots, they absorbed Viking settlers, they felt the currents of history that affected the broader British Isles. But compared to communities in mainland Europe, they were profoundly isolated by the sea. The weather of the North Atlantic is not hospitable to casual travel. The islands are genuinely difficult to reach and leave. For many centuries, the people who were born on them died on them, and the gene pool turned over slowly. This isolation is itself part of the answer to why they look different. Even setting aside all the deep history of Mesolithic ancestry and Atlantic refugia and Neolithic maritime networks, simple isolation over centuries tends to preserve and concentrate whatever was there. If the founding population of, say, Lewis in the Outer Hebrides 2,000 years ago had a particular profile of physical characteristics, those characteristics would tend to persist and even intensify in subsequent generations, simply because the community was too isolated for the usual mixing that dilutes regional distinctiveness elsewhere. But the isolation was not just geographic. It was linguistic and cultural as well. Scottish Gaelic, one of the most conservative members of the Celtic language family, survived longest in the Western Isles and is still spoken there today by a small but dedicated community. Language is not just a communication system. It is a container for a way of seeing the world, a system of categories and concepts and emotional textures that shapes thought in ways that speakers of other languages do not have access to. The Gaelic-speaking communities of the Outer Hebrides maintained, through their language, a relationship to their landscape and their history that was not available in English translation. The names of places carried embedded histories. The patterns of traditional song and story preserved connections to the past that written literature, with its tendency to edit and formalize and smooth away the rough edges, often loses. This is not romanticism. It is an observable fact that language communities that have maintained continuous oral traditions over many centuries preserve information in those traditions that is not available from any other source. The acoustic properties of specific locations for fishing, the behavior of weather patterns in specific seasons, the timing of animal migrations and plant flowerings calibrated to a specific landscape over generations of observation. This kind of knowledge, accumulated over centuries and encoded in the daily speech and traditional practice of island communities, is a form of archive that no museum can replicate. When that knowledge is threatened, when young people leave for the cities and the language stops being transmitted and the traditional practices disappear, something genuinely irreplaceable is lost. Not just culturally, practically. The world loses access to information that took millennia to accumulate and has no other repository. The people of the Scottish Islands look different from other Europeans for many reasons. The deepest of those reasons is genetic and goes back further in time than most people know to look. But the visible expression of that difference, in faces and bodies, and the particular quality of presence that observers have been noting for centuries, is inseparable from the cultural and linguistic framework in which those people have lived. You cannot separate the genetics from the island life, the Gaelic from the stone walls, the ancient bloodlines from the particular quality of light on a Hebridean morning that has been shaping the perception and expression of human experience here for longer than almost anywhere else in Europe. Genetics works through multiple different windows, and each window shows you something the others do not. The full nuclear genome tells you the most complete story, but it is also the most complex and requires the most sophisticated analysis. Two simpler, and in some ways more dramatically informative windows are the Y chromosome, which passes from father to son, largely unchanged across generations, and the mitochondrial DNA, which passes from mother to child, also largely unchanged, in an unbroken maternal line. The Y chromosome haplogroups found in Scottish Island populations tell a story that reinforces everything we have been discussing. Haplogroup R, 1b, the most common Y chromosome lineage in Western Europe, is very common in the Scottish Islands. This haplogroup is associated with the expansion of steppe ancestry peoples into Western Europe in the Bronze Age, though its deep origins are still debated. But, alongside R, 1b, and in proportions that are higher than in most of the rest of Britain, Scottish Island populations carry haplogroup I, and, specifically, the subclade I2, which is one of the oldest Y chromosome lineages in Europe and is strongly associated with the Mesolithic hunter-gatherers who were here before the farmers arrived. This ancient I haplogroup carrier is not just a statistical footnote. He is, in terms of direct male line ancestry, a descendant of the people who fished the rivers of Doggerland and watched the sea rise around them. His Y chromosome has been passing from father to son for perhaps 10,000 years without leaving the Atlantic fringe. He may live in Stornoway or Lerwick or Portree. He may work as a fisherman or a teacher or in an oil industry support role. He may never have heard of Doggerland or Mesolithic hunter-gatherers or Western hunter-gatherer genomic components. But every time a cell in his body divides, his Y chromosome replicates a sequence that has been replicating in roughly the same place for 100 centuries. The mitochondrial haplogroups tell a similar story on the maternal side. Haplogroup U5, and particularly its subclades U5A and U5B, are strongly associated with the ancient European hunter-gatherer populations. They are the mitochondrial equivalent of the Y chromosome, that I lineage, ancient markers of the people who were here before farming. And they survive in elevated frequencies in Scottish Island populations compared to most of the rest of Europe. The woman carrying mitochondrial haplogroup U5B in a Lewis Croft in the 21st century has a continuous maternal line connecting her, through her mother, her grandmother, her great-grandmother and beyond, back through the Neolithic farmers and the Mesolithic hunters to women who lived on shores that are now under the North Sea. She is, in the most direct and literal biological sense, an heir of Doggerland. That is not metaphor, it is genetics. All of the evidence we have discussed, the genetic admixture analyses, the haplogroup frequencies, the cranial morphology studies, the archaeological record of the Atlantic megalith builders, the folk tradition of the Selkies, the survival of ancient linguistic elements in Pictish and in Gaelic, the peculiar persistence of AH-negative blood frequencies in Atlantic fringe populations, all of it points in the same direction. The Scottish Island populations are the inheritors of an ancient Atlantic ancestry that predates the major waves of continental migration that reshaped most of Europe in the Neolithic and Bronze Age periods. But there is a question that this evidence raises that science, in its current state, cannot fully answer. What was it like to be one of those ancient people? What was the world like before Doggerland drowned? What did the landscape of the North Sea basin look like when it was above water? When rivers crossed it and forests grew in its valleys and human communities lived in its marshes and along its shores, what did they believe? What stories did they tell? What languages did they speak? What did they call the water that was slowly, then catastrophically, taking their world from them? We do not know. We cannot know, in any direct sense. The evidence does not reach that far. We have some of their tools, recovered by trawlers dragging the seafloor. We have some of their bones, dredged from the same sediments. We have, in the DNA of their descendants, an echo of their biology, but their voices are silent. Their stories are lost. Whatever language they spoke, whatever myths they told, whatever names they gave to the rivers and hills and sacred places of a world that no longer exists, those things are as submerged as the landscape they described. What we have instead are the people, the living descendants, carrying in their cells the biological record of everything that happened to their ancestors over 10,000 years. Looking at those people, studying their genetics and their physical characteristics and their surviving cultural traditions is the closest we can come to hearing the voices of the Doggerlanders. There is something both wonderful and heartbreaking about that. Wonderful because the thread survived at all, because those ancient people are not simply gone, because something of them persists in the world. Heartbreaking because what persists is a biological echo rather than a cultural memory, a frequency distribution in a genomic database, rather than a story told around a fire, a measurement in a population genetics study, rather than a name. But perhaps that is what all history ultimately is: an echo, a trace, a faint impression in a medium that was never designed to hold it, preserved more by accident than intention, fragmentary and incomplete, and therefore, in its incompleteness, all the more compelling. We study the ancient world not because we can reconstruct it fully, but because the attempt to reconstruct it teaches us something about where we came from, and therefore, in some sense, about who we are. The Scottish Islanders look different from other Europeans because of a set of historical contingencies that unfolded over 10,000 years. Because a landscape drowned and forced its people to high ground. Because the high ground happened to be islands at the far edge of the continent, where subsequent waves of migration arrived late and in small numbers. Because those islands produced communities that were isolated enough, for long enough, that the ancient genetic patterns could persist. Because a maritime tradition, older than farming, continued in communities that had always lived from the sea. And because, somewhere under the water between Scotland and Denmark, a world that no modern human has ever seen lies preserved in the cold dark, and the people living on the rocks above it still carry, in their blood and their faces, something of that world's memory. There is a detail in the story of Stonehenge that most people do not know, and it illuminates the broader picture of the Atlantic megalith builders and their connection to the Scottish island tradition in a remarkable way. The blue stones of Stonehenge, the smaller inner ring of standing stones at the monument, were not quarried locally. They were brought from the Preseli Hills of southwestern Wales, a distance of roughly 300 kilometres, almost certainly by sea. The specific quarry sites have been identified by geologists in the last decade with extraordinary precision. They are at Carn Guadog and Rosythlin, places in the Pembrokeshire landscape that the ancient builders of Stonehenge somehow identified as the source of the stone they needed, and then transported that stone across the Bristol Channel and up the coast of England. Why those stones? Why travel 300 kilometres when there was perfectly adequate stone available locally? Archaeologists have debated this for decades. One answer involves the properties of the stone itself. The Preseli bluestones have distinctive acoustic properties. When struck, they ring. They produce a tone that can be heard from a considerable distance. In some traditions, stones with these acoustic properties are considered to have spiritual power, to be living things, to carry within them a kind of voice. But there is another answer that the genetic and archaeological evidence now makes more plausible. Stonehenge was built, in its several phases, by communities who were part of the Atlantic megalithic network we have been discussing. The builders of Stonehenge and the builders of the monuments on Orkney, and the builders of the passage tombs of Ireland and the builders of the stone rows in Brittany were all, to varying degrees, participating in a shared cultural tradition that stretched the length of the Atlantic coast. They moved people and ideas and materials along those sea roads with a facility that modern researchers have consistently underestimated. For those communities, the Preseli Hills may have been significant not just for their stone but for their cultural meaning. Perhaps a major monument in the Preseli landscape was the spiritual centre of the Atlantic network in southern Britain. Perhaps the bluestones came from a place that was already sacred to the builder's tradition, making them spiritually appropriate building materials for a monument intended to stand for the ages. Whatever the reason, the logistics are staggering. Moving 80 or more stones, each weighing between 2 and 5 tons, 300 kilometres by sea and land, using only the technology available in the Neolithic period, was an organizational achievement that challenges our assumptions about what prehistoric communities were capable of. These were not simple people. They were accomplished engineers and seafarers and social organizers who could coordinate effort across enormous distances and over what must have been many years of sustained collective activity. And the same tradition, the same network, the same capacity for ambitious long-distance project management is present in the Scottish Islands. The Ring of Brodgar and the stones of Stennis on Orkney are not provincial imitations of Stonehenge. They are parallel expressions of the same Atlantic tradition, possibly earlier than Stonehenge in some respects, possibly contributing ideas and techniques that flowed southward rather than the other way around. The Atlantic megalithic tradition was not a hierarchy with a single center radiating influence outward. It was a network, a conversation conducted in stone, with participants adding their voices from Portugal to Orkney over a period of more than 2,000 years. The people of the Scottish Islands are the descendants of those participants. When a stonemason in Lewis shapes a lintel, or a farmer in Orkney finds a fragment of Neolithic pottery in a ploughed field, they are not disconnected from that tradition. They are its continuation, attenuated and changed beyond recognition by the centuries, but unbroken. In the years since the development of affordable whole genome sequencing, the pace of discovery in ancient DNA research has accelerated beyond what most researchers predicted. Ancient bones that would have yielded nothing useful to researchers a decade ago can now be sequenced with enough depth to produce detailed genomic profiles. Every year, new studies add hundreds or thousands of ancient genomes to the databases that researchers use to trace the movements and mixtures of ancient populations. What has this revolution in ancient DNA revealed about the Scottish island populations specifically? Several landmark studies in the past decade have examined ancient genomes from Scottish contexts and compared them to modern population samples. The results have consistently supported what we have been discussing. The modern populations of the Scottish Islands carry a genetic profile that is notably different from other British populations, with elevated contributions from the oldest ancestral layers, the Mesolithic hunter-gatherers and the earliest Neolithic farmers, and relatively lower contributions from the later Bronze Age, steppe ancestry migration. A study published in the last few years, specifically examining genetic diversity across the British Isles, found that the populations of the Outer Hebrides and the Northern Isles clustered separately from mainland British populations when the analysis was run with sufficient resolution to detect regional differences. The separation was not dramatic in absolute terms. The populations are clearly all related, but it was statistically clear and consistent across multiple analytical approaches. Perhaps more striking were the analyses of specific functional genetic variants. Some genetic variants that influence observable physical characteristics, such as eye color, hair texture, and various aspects of facial morphology, show different frequency distributions in island Scottish populations compared to mainland British and continental European populations. These differences are subtle but detectable, and they track in the expected direction with the deeper ancestral component that distinguishes the island populations. There have also been intriguing results from studies of disease genetics. Some disease-relevant genetic variants show unusual frequencies in Scottish island populations. Some of these represent the expected effects of small population isolation and genetic drift, rare variants that have been amplified by chance in restricted gene pools. But others appear to reflect the ancient ancestral background, variants that were present in the Mesolithic hunter-gatherers and have been maintained in populations that carry the highest proportions of that ancient ancestry. The picture that emerges from this research is not simple. Human genetics is never simple, but it is coherent. The Scottish island populations are, in measurable and meaningful terms, the genetic inheritors of an ancient Atlantic world. They carry more of the deep European past in their genomes than any other major population group in the British Isles, and among the highest proportions in all of Europe. This is not a small thing, it is not a curiosity. It is a window into a period of human prehistory about which we know remarkably little, and that window is open, living, walking around in the 21st century, in the form of the people of Lewis and Harris and Orkney and Shetland and the Hebridean Islands and the Atlantic coast of the Scottish mainland. There is a sadness running under all of this that it would be dishonest to ignore. The communities we have been discussing, those island populations that have preserved, through accident and geography and stubborn persistence, something of the oldest human legacy in Europe, are not in a stable condition. They are, many of them, shrinking. The young leave for the cities, the old remain, the languages contract, the traditional practices fade. The intimate knowledge of local landscapes and maritime conditions and seasonal patterns that took millennia to accumulate is disappearing, one generation at a time, with a speed that no academic study can adequately document before it is gone. Scottish Gaelic, the language that has carried the cultural traditions of the Western Isles for over 1,000 years, has around 60,000 speakers remaining, and the number has been declining for generations, despite substantial government support and revival efforts. Norn, the Norse-derived language of the Northern Isles, is already extinct, having died in the 18th and 19th centuries under pressure from English. The traditional fishing and farming practices that structured life in the islands for centuries have been largely displaced by modern economic patterns. What is lost when these communities contract? Not just culture in some abstract sense, actual information, specific, irreplaceable knowledge of specific places, accumulated over generations of close observation and encoded in traditional practice and local language. The name of a particular fishing ground in Gaelic carries embedded information about currents, depths, and seasonal fish behavior that a GPS coordinate does not. The knowledge of which local plants to use for which purposes, accumulated through generations of trial and the careful observation that comes from having no alternative, is not available in any book, because no one ever thought it important enough to write down. This is not a lament for a romantic past that never existed. Island life was genuinely hard. Poverty was real. The clearances of the 18th and 19th centuries, when Scottish island communities were forcibly evicted from their lands by landlords seeking to convert them to more profitable sheep walks, were genuine atrocities. And their demographic effects, the emptying of communities that had been continuously inhabited for millennia, are still visible in the landscape and the genetics of the surviving population. The point is simply that what is being lost, alongside the genuine hardships and unjust structures of the past, is something irreplaceable, and that its loss is happening without most people outside the communities being aware of it, let alone mourning it. The genetic distinctiveness that we have spent the past several hours tracing through deep time will, of course, eventually be diluted as well. Not through catastrophe, but through the ordinary processes of migration and intermarriage and the demographic changes that come with modernity. The signal will not disappear entirely. It will not disappear soon. But it will, over generations, become harder to detect as the populations that carry it continue to integrate with the broader genetic landscape of Britain and Europe. What will remain when the signal is gone? The stones. The archaeology that continues to be excavated from the island landscapes and the surrounding seabed. The genetic data that has already been collected and will continue to be collected as the research goes on. The place names, those remarkable fossil linguistic specimens carved into the landscape in Norse and Gaelic, and in older layers underneath both that we can sometimes glimpse but not fully read. And the stories that have been told on these islands for as long as anyone can remember, about the sea and the land and the people who have lived between them since before history began. Stories about the Selkies, stories about the ancestors. Stories about the old people who were here before the Gaels and the Norse and the Romans and the farmers from the south. The old people who left no writing, but left their bones in the earth and their blood in the veins of those who came after. Those stories are still being told. They are being told in Gaelic by the people who still speak it. They are being told in English by the people who have lost the Gaelic, but not the impulse to make sense of where they come from. They are being told, in the language of population genetics, by the researchers who are patiently decoding the information written in the genomes of living people and ancient bones. All of these tellings are partial. All of them are incomplete. None of them captures the whole. But together, they come closer to the truth than any single version could alone. The people of the Scottish Islands are different from other Europeans because the world conspired over 10,000 years to preserve something in them that was otherwise lost. They are the inheritors of a deep past that most of their contemporaries can only read about in scientific papers. And they carry that inheritance, most of them, without knowing it, living their lives on islands at the edge of the Atlantic that have been at the edge of everything for longer than almost any inhabited place in the world. There is something both eerie and compelling about the fact that the world whose legacy we have been tracing is still there, under the water, just a few dozen meters under the water in the shallowest parts of the North Sea, not buried under sediment in any complete sense, still accessible, in principle, to instruments that can see through water and mud to the ancient landscape beneath. The study of submerged prehistoric landscapes, what researchers call underwater archaeology, or maritime archaeology, when it involves sites that are now underwater, is one of the newest and in some respects most technically demanding branches of the discipline. The challenges are obvious. Water and darkness and sediment and the corrosive marine environment make access and excavation difficult in ways that land archaeology does not face. The equipment required, submersibles, remotely operated vehicles, sophisticated acoustic mapping systems, adds expense that many projects cannot justify. But the results, when the work is done, are extraordinary. Surveys of the Dogger Bank and the broader southern and central North Sea have already revealed substantial evidence of the Mesolithic landscape. Riverbeds buried under the modern seafloor, ancient lake sediments containing pollen and plant material that allow researchers to reconstruct the vegetation of the lost landscape, animal bones, human artifacts. In some areas, the preservation is remarkable, better than comparable sites on land, because the waterlogged anaerobic conditions of the seafloor can protect organic materials that would have long since rotted on dry ground. One of the most emotionally affecting categories of finds from the drowned Doggerland landscape is human bones. Not many, but enough to remind us that this was not just an abstract landscape in a genetic model, it was a place where people lived and died, where children were born and grew up and learned the names of the rivers and the fishing spots, where old people told the stories that connected the living to the ancestors, where, at some point, those same ancestors built fires on the shore and watched the water rising around them and did not know, could not have known, that they were witnessing the end of a world. The human remains from Dogger Bank contexts are usually fragmentary. A skull here, a femur there, churned out of the sediment by trawls and currents. But even fragmentary, they carry the same information that ancient bones from land sites carry: DNA. Physical measurements, the chemical signatures in bone that allow researchers to determine what people ate and where they lived. These bones are being studied. They are yielding information about the Mesolithic people of Doggerland that no other source can provide. And what they are confirming is that the people who lived on Doggerland before it drowned were ancestrally connected to the populations who survive with the most complete ancient genetic signal today. The modern Scottish Islanders are not just metaphorically connected to Doggerland, they are literally, genetically, connected through an unbroken line of biological descent to the people whose bones lie under the North Sea. When a trawler pulls up a piece of Mesolithic antler from the Dogger Bank, or a fragment of flint that was shaped by human hands 12,000 years ago and has been lying on the seafloor in the dark ever since, it is pulling up a piece of the ancestry of living people, people who live on Shetland or Lewis or Orkney, people who are going about their 21st century lives without knowing that their inheritance includes a drowned continent. There is still a great deal to learn about Doggerland. The surveys that have been done, impressive as they are, cover only a small fraction of the total area. The ancient coastlines and river systems of the central and northern parts of the former landmass have barely been studied. The site of the Storegga tsunami's impact on the Doggerland coastline, the zone where the catastrophic flooding would have been most immediate and most devastating, has not been systematically investigated. There are almost certainly settlement sites, hearths, burial places, preserved in the cold dark of the southern North Sea that would transform our understanding of the Mesolithic world. The technology to find and study them exists, or is being developed. The questions are finding the funding, the political will, and the international cooperation between the several nations whose waters overlie the Doggerland landscape. Norway, Denmark, the Netherlands, Germany, and the United Kingdom all have territorial claims over different portions of the drowned land. Coordinating research across those jurisdictions is not simple, but the urgency is there. The seafloor is not static. Trawling continues to disturb the sediments. Commercial development, the construction of offshore wind farms in the North Sea, is accelerating the physical disruption of these sites. Every year that passes without systematic investigation is a year in which the archive of Doggerland is being diminished. The people of the Scottish Islands, who carry in their cells the most direct genetic connection to the people who once lived on that lost landscape, have a stake in this research that is more than academic. Their oldest ancestors are down there. Their deepest roots are in a place that is now underwater. And the story of who they are and where they came from is, at its most ancient layer, a story that is still being written by researchers drawing sonar maps of a drowned world. There is a broader principle embedded in this story that extends beyond the specific case of the Scottish Islands. It concerns what happens at the edges of things, at the margins where the main currents of history flow less strongly and where, as a result, older patterns survive more completely. Biogeographers have a concept called refugia, places where populations survive during periods of environmental stress because the local conditions are more favorable than the broader landscape. During ice ages, refugia in the south and west of Europe preserved plant and animal species that were otherwise exterminated by the cold. When the ice retreated, the survivors from those refugia recolonized the newly available landscape, carrying the genetic diversity that had been compressed and preserved in their refuge. Something similar happens with human populations and cultural pressures. When a demographic wave, whether agricultural expansion, pastoral migration, conquest, or assimilation, sweeps across a landscape, it tends to flow most efficiently across accessible terrain and to falter at the margins. The islands, the mountains, the deserts at the edge of the world that the main wave cannot easily penetrate, these become refugia for whatever was there before. The Scottish Islands are one of the most dramatic examples of this phenomenon in European prehistory. But they are not unique. The Basques in their Pyrenean refuge, the Sardinians on their Mediterranean island, the populations of the Caucasus Mountains, preserving extraordinary linguistic and genetic diversity in a landscape that deflected every major migration for thousands of years. The highland indigenous communities of the Americas that survived conquest by retreating into jungle and mountain terrain that European settlers found hostile. The Aboriginal Australian communities that preserved the oldest continuous cultural traditions on Earth by living in landscapes that colonial agriculture found unworkable. All of these are expressions of the same principle. The edges of things are where the oldest information survives. Not because the people there are somehow frozen in time, which they are not, but because the geography that made them marginal to the main currents of demographic history also made them resilient to the forces that elsewhere erased the past. This has implications that extend beyond the merely academic. We live in a world where the processes that once created refugia, geographic isolation, environmental difficulty, are being overcome at an accelerating rate. The places that were once unreachable are now reachable. The communities that were once too remote for the main currents of economic development to reach are now connected to those currents by the internet and cheap air travel and global supply chains. The same processes that are bringing material improvement to many of those communities are also dissolving the conditions that made them refugia in the first place. What is lost when the last refugia are absorbed into the global mainstream? Not just romantic diversity, though that matters. Actual information. The accumulated knowledge encoded in languages that are going extinct. The ecological wisdom embedded in traditional practices that have sustained specific environments for centuries or millennia. The genetic diversity represented by populations that have been separated from others long enough to develop distinctive combinations of variants that may turn out to be important for medicine or our understanding of human biology. The Scottish Islands are a microcosm of this global situation. The loss of Scottish Gaelic is not just the loss of a minority language. It is the loss of a vessel for information about the Scottish island environment and its human history that cannot be fully translated into English without losing something essential. The decline of traditional island communities is not just a demographic statistic. It is the dissolution of a way of living that carried, in its daily practices, an accumulated archive of 10,000 years of human experience in one of the world's most challenging environments. None of this means that island communities should be preserved in amber, prevented from changing or accessing the benefits that the modern world offers. Change is not the problem. What matters is whether what is valuable in the old can be documented, understood, and honored before it is transformed beyond recovery. Whether the people who carry these traditions can be the agents of that documentation rather than its passive subjects. Whether the scientific and cultural institutions of the broader society can find ways to value and support communities that carry irreplaceable human heritage, rather than treating them as interesting case studies to be studied, and then left to find their own way in a world not designed for them. The people of the Scottish Islands deserve more than the attention of population geneticists and folklorists, however valuable that attention is. They deserve the recognition that they are the holders of something extraordinarily ancient and precious, something that belongs not just to them, but to the whole human story. They are the inheritors of Doggerland. They are the last keepers of a world that drowned. The story of the Scottish Islands cannot be told without confronting one of the most traumatic chapters in their recent history. The highland clearances of the 18th and 19th centuries were not a minor historical footnote. They were a systematic and often violently enforced depopulation of highland and island communities that had been continuously inhabited for millennia. The clearances were driven by economic forces. Sheep farming, in the aftermath of the Industrial Revolution and the expansion of textile manufacturing, was more profitable than supporting the communities of small tenant farmers, crofters and cotters, who had farmed the same land for generations. Landlords, many of them absentee owners who had inherited or purchased highland estates from the traditional clan chiefs, evicted those communities to make way for the sheep. In some cases, the evictions were accompanied by the burning of houses to prevent displaced families from returning. The scale of the displacement was enormous. Tens of thousands of people were forced off land their families had farmed and fished for generations. Many were transported to the coast and resettled in new crofting townships on marginal land that was barely capable of supporting them. Many others emigrated to Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and the United States, carrying with them the genetic legacy and cultural traditions of the ancient Atlantic communities. There is a bitter irony in this diaspora. The people who were most forcibly displaced from the Scottish Islands, the ones whose communities were most thoroughly disrupted, were often those whose ancestors had been there longest. The crofting communities of the Western Isles and the northern mainland had, in many cases, maintained continuous occupation since the Neolithic. They were, in genetic terms, among the most direct inheritors of the ancient Atlantic legacy we have been tracing. Their forcible displacement was not just a social injustice, it was a genetic and cultural disruption whose effects are still visible in the demographic structure of the islands today. The bottleneck effect of the clearances, the reduction of large indigenous populations to small remnant communities on marginal land, paradoxically reinforced the genetic distinctiveness of those who remained. A small population on a small island with reduced access to the broader marriage market will inevitably become more genetically uniform over generations. Whatever was distinctive in the original population becomes more concentrated in the reduced community. The clearances, in their brutal demographic effects, may have inadvertently intensified some of the genetic distinctiveness of the surviving island communities. This is not a silver lining to a genuine atrocity. It is simply an observation about how demographic history and genetics interact. The clearances were an injustice regardless of any incidental genetic effects. But the genetic evidence of their impact, visible in the unusual uniformity of some island gene pools and in the particular combinations of ancient ancestry that characterize the surviving communities, is part of the story of who these people are today. We started this journey on a cliff above the Atlantic, watching the light change on water the color of old iron. Let us end it there, or near there. Consider what it means to look at a face. When you look at another person's face, your brain is performing an extraordinarily complex computation that you are entirely unconscious of. You are reading thousands of subtle features, the proportions of the brow and the cheekbones and the jaw, the depth of the eye sockets, the particular quality of the skin, the shape of the nose, the set of the mouth, at rest, and synthesizing them into an impression that happens faster than conscious thought. This impression tells you things about health and age, an emotional state, and, at some level that consciousness rarely accesses, something about genetic distance and similarity. This last piece, the unconscious assessment of genetic similarity, is ancient. It is probably older than speech. Our primate ancestors were reading each other's faces for information about kinship long before any of them could have articulated what they were doing. When we see a face that is slightly different, in subtle ways that we cannot name, from the faces we grew up around, something in us notices. Not as a judgment, necessarily, just as an observation, a sense of encountering something outside the familiar pattern. The faces of the Scottish island communities are, for most people from continental Europe or even from southern Britain, subtly different in ways that land below the threshold of articulation. Most observers cannot say what it is. They can only say that there is something, a particular quality of stillness in the brow, a depth in the eye socket that catches the light differently, a facial geometry that seems somehow older, that matches no contemporary cultural template, that points somewhere that conscious thought cannot quite follow. What those observers are detecting, without knowing it, is 10,000 years of deep ancestry. The particular combination of Mesolithic and early Neolithic and Atlantic maritime genetics that has been preserved more completely than almost anywhere else in the faces and bones of the people who live at the western edge of Europe. They are seeing, in the 21st century, the face of a world that drowned before writing was invented. That is not poetry. It is the most precise description available of what the science actually says. The faces remember what the records forgot. The bones remember what the stories lost. The blood remembers what the landscape, buried under the North Sea, can no longer say for itself. The people of the Scottish Islands are not simply different from other Europeans in some interesting demographic sense. They are, in the most direct genetic meaning of the word, the survivors. The people whose ancestors rode out the flooding of Doggerland on high ground. The people whose ancient ancestry survived 3 major waves of continental migration by virtue of being exactly far enough from the center of things to avoid being completely replaced. The people whose genetic legacy stretches back, in an unbroken biological chain, to a world that modern humans have never seen and can only partially reconstruct. That makes them, among other things, a kind of living archive. An archive written not in paper or stone or clay, but in cells, in chromosomes, in the particular frequencies of ancient genetic variants that have been copying themselves faithfully in every generation since before the megalith builders raised their first stones. Archives require readers. The readers, in this case, are the geneticists and archaeologists and paleoanthropologists who are slowly, painstakingly, learning the language that the archive is written in. Every new ancient genome that is sequenced, every new population study, every new analytical technique adds another line to the translation. The story becomes more legible every year. What it says, as we can currently read it, is that the Scottish Islanders are different from other Europeans because they have preserved more of the common European past than almost anyone else. They are not anomalies. They are not outliers in some negative sense. They are the keepers, unwitting and unchosen, of something that most of their contemporaries lost long before they were born. The story of Doggerland is the story of a world before ours. The story of the Scottish Islands is the story of what that world left behind when the water rose. And the story of the people who live there now is the story of what it means to carry, in your face and your blood and your bones, the memory of something so ancient that no one alive can read it directly. Only the cells remember, and they are, still, telling the story. And so we come to the end of this long walk through the deep past, through drowned worlds and ancient coastlines, through the genetics of populations that moved and mixed and sometimes, against all odds, stayed where they were and held their ground through 10,000 years of change. The next time you see a photograph of a Hebridean face, or sit across from someone from Shetland or Orkney or the Western Isles, and feel that indefinable sense of encountering something whose depth you cannot quite locate, perhaps you will understand now what you are sensing. Not strangeness, antiquity, not difference for its own sake, the survival of something extraordinarily ancient in a world that has erased almost everything that came before. The water that drowned Doggerland is still there. The North Sea is still there. On a clear day from the cliffs of Shetland, you can look out over water that covers a landscape where human beings once lived, where children learned the names of things, where the old people told the stories that connected the living to those who had gone before. That world is gone. Its people are not, quite. Something of them survives. Something of them is, today, looking back at you. We do not know what the Doggerlanders believed. We do not know what stories they told or what they called themselves or what language they spoke. We do not know what music they made, if any, or what they built of materials too perishable to survive. We only know that they were here, that they lived and watched the water rise, and some of them found high ground, and their children's children's children built the stone circles of Orkney, and fished the Atlantic in skin boats, and told stories about creatures that were neither fully human nor fully animal, that came from the sea and went back to it, that could not quite belong to either world. We only know that their blood is still here, flowing in the veins of people who wake up every morning to the sound of the Atlantic and go about their lives without knowing that they are, in the most precise genetic sense available to modern science, the heirs of a world under the water. That is the real reason the Scottish Islanders look different from other Europeans, not because they are separate from the human story, because they are, in some ways that matter, closer to its beginning. If this journey has given you something to carry with you into sleep, into tomorrow, into the next time you think about where you come from and what that means, then it has done what it was meant to do. The deep past is not dead. It is not even past. It is present in the faces of living people, in the frequencies of genetic variants in modern cells, in the stones that still stand on windy hillsides above the Atlantic. It is present in you, wherever you are listening from, because you too are the heir of migrations and catastrophes and survivals that unfolded long before any record was kept of them. Your ancestry, like theirs, goes back further than any name you can put to it. Your face, like theirs, remembers things that your conscious mind has never been told. We are all, in that sense, heirs of Doggerland, heirs of a world before the world as we know it. The Scottish Islanders are simply the ones who preserved the most of it. Rest now. The water outside your window, wherever you are, is connected to all the other water. The North Sea is connected to the Atlantic, is connected to whatever ocean or river or lake might be near where you are sleeping tonight. The same water that drowned Doggerland is still moving, still changing coastlines, still carrying sediment from one place and depositing it in another. The story is not over. It is not even close to over. The cells in your body are still copying the information they received from your ancestors, the information that came from their ancestors. Back and back and back, through all the floods and migrations and catastrophes and survivals, to something at the beginning that none of us can name but that all of us carry. Let that thought carry you gently towards sleep. You are old. You are very, very old. Older than you know. And the world that made you is still out there, waiting to be found. It is worth pausing here to appreciate just how recent all of this knowledge actually is. The story we have been telling, the genetic layering of ancient populations in the Scottish Islands, the connection to the drowned world of Doggerland, the survival of Mesolithic ancestry in elevated proportions among Atlantic fringe communities. None of this was known or knowable 20 years ago. Some of it was barely speculated about 10 years ago. The revolution in ancient DNA technology that has made it possible is one of the most extraordinary scientific developments of the early 21st century, and it is still accelerating. The problem with studying ancient DNA is that DNA is not a stable molecule. It degrades over time. The longer ago a sample died, the more its genetic material has been broken down by bacteria, by oxidation, by the chemistry of the surrounding soil. For a long time, this meant that ancient DNA research was limited to material from the last few thousand years and to samples from exceptional preservation environments, permafrost, cold and dry caves, the kind of conditions that slow the usual pace of molecular degradation. Two developments changed everything. The first was the development of increasingly sensitive sequencing technologies that could read DNA from tiny and highly degraded samples, reconstructing the original sequence from fragments only tens of base pairs long. The second was the development of sophisticated bioinformatic methods for identifying and filtering out the contamination from modern DNA that inevitably accompanies any ancient sample, and for reconstructing complete or near-complete genomes from the degraded fragments that survive. With these tools, researchers began sequencing ancient genomes from sites across Europe and the world. The first results were startling. The ancient populations of Europe turned out to be far more different from modern Europeans than anyone had expected. The Mesolithic hunter-gatherers of Europe, when their genomes were finally sequenced, proved to be genetically distinct from any modern European population, closer in some respects to modern East Asians or Native Americans than to the contemporary Europeans who now occupy the same landscapes. They were not, in other words, simply early versions of modern Europeans. They were something genuinely different, a population with its own distinct history and its own ancestral origins, which had been substantially replaced by later incoming populations. The early European farmers who followed them were different again. When their genomes were sequenced, they proved to be closely related to modern populations in Sardinia and the broader Middle East, confirming that the agricultural revolution involved a genuine movement of people, not just a movement of ideas. The farmers who came to Europe came from the Near East, and they brought their Near Eastern genome with them. And the Yamnaya-related steppe pastoralists who arrived later were different still, clustering most closely with modern populations from the Pontic steppe region of Ukraine and Russia, and carrying distinctive genetic signatures that are now found at high frequency across much of Central and Northern Europe. 3 waves, 3 genetically distinct populations, all contributing to the modern European genome in proportions that vary dramatically from place to place. And in the Scottish Islands, that variation tells a story unlike anywhere else in Europe. The specific studies that illuminated the Scottish picture began with broad surveys of British and Irish genetic diversity. Researchers from Oxford, from the Wellcome Sanger Institute, from Edinburgh and Aberdeen and Dublin assembled large databases of genetic data from across the British Isles and compared them to the growing library of ancient European genomes. What emerged, with increasing clarity as the datasets grew larger and the analytical methods more sophisticated, was a picture of remarkable regional differentiation within Britain itself. The populations of the Scottish Islands did not cluster with the populations of southern England. They did not cluster with the populations of mainland Scotland in quite the same way. They clustered with each other, and with the populations of Ireland's Atlantic coast, and with the populations of Wales, in a way that pointed to a shared genetic heritage distinct from the rest of Britain. And when that shared heritage was decomposed into its ancestral components, it showed, consistently and reproducibly, a higher proportion of the oldest ancestral layer, the Mesolithic Western hunter-gatherer component, than any comparable grouping of British or continental European populations. The numbers, expressed in the dry mathematical language of population genetics, were remarkable. While most continental European populations carry Western hunter-gatherer ancestry components in the range of 5 to 15% of their total genomic ancestry, the Scottish island populations showed WHG components approaching 25%, and in some communities even higher. The difference is not subtle. It is not within the range of measurement uncertainty. It is real, reproducible, and significant. But what does 25% WHG ancestry mean in practical terms? It means that roughly 1 in 4 of the ancestral lineages that come together in a Scottish islander's genome derive, in the final analysis, from the people who lived in Europe before farming arrived, before the agrarian revolution, before the megalithic building tradition, before the metal ages and the language shifts and all the other transformations that we use to mark the transitions of prehistory. 1 in 4 of those lineages goes back, without interruption, to the Mesolithic world. That is an extraordinary survival. It represents 10,000 years of persistence in the face of demographic forces that elsewhere erased that ancient ancestry almost entirely. It is the genetic equivalent of finding a medieval manuscript in a modern library, intact and readable, when you know that virtually every other copy of that manuscript was destroyed centuries ago. The researchers who first identified this pattern were careful about their language, as scientists should be. They noted the methodological complexities. They acknowledged the uncertainties in the ancestral component analysis. They were appropriately cautious about drawing strong conclusions from preliminary data. But as the datasets grew and the results were replicated by independent teams using different methods, the picture became increasingly solid. The Scottish island populations really are different, and they are different in a direction that points unambiguously toward the deep past. More recent research has begun to fill in the details of how this happened, tracing the genetic history of specific island communities through multiple time periods using ancient DNA from archaeological sites. The results are still being analyzed and published, but the emerging picture is consistent with what we have described. The Atlantic fringe populations have maintained higher levels of ancient ancestry through multiple demographic transitions, absorbing new genetic inputs from the farming revolution and the steppe expansion without losing the deeper ancestral substrate to the degree that happened elsewhere. The mechanism was probably geography, as we have argued, but it may also have been something else, something harder to quantify but potentially important: social structure. The Mesolithic communities of Atlantic Europe were, by everything we can reconstruct about their way of life, highly adapted to marine environments. They were expert fishermen and shellfish gatherers and sea mammal hunters. They had boats, or at least watercraft of some kind, capable of navigating the Atlantic coast and the waters between the islands. They had almost certainly extensive social networks stretching along the coast that allowed them to exchange mates and knowledge and resources across what were, from a land-based perspective, very large distances. When the farming communities arrived, they arrived by land. They followed river valleys and mountain passes and the corridors between forests, moving from one productive patch of agricultural land to the next. They were, fundamentally, land-based people. Their social networks and their economic strategies were organized around access to soil, not access to sea. The coastal communities of Mesolithic Europe, living in environments that the farmers found marginal and difficult to exploit, would have been under less direct demographic pressure than their counterparts in the interior. Not because the farmers ignored them, but because the farmers' core resource, productive arable land, was not what the coastal communities depended on. The shellfish beds and the fish runs and the seal haulouts that sustained the Mesolithic communities were not things that farming technology could monopolize or displace. They were available to whoever had the skills to exploit them. In that coastal environment, the Mesolithic people had skills the farmers did not. And skill, in a pre-industrial economy, is a form of power. The coastal communities may have been able to maintain themselves as distinct, functioning social units, even as farming spread across the interior, precisely because they occupied an ecological niche that the farmers had neither the knowledge nor the technology to dominate. Over time, of course, the integration happened. The genetics make that clear. The island communities are not purely Mesolithic. They carry farming ancestry and steppe ancestry alongside the ancient hunter-gatherer component. But the integration was slower and more balanced than it was elsewhere, and the ancient layer, rather than being diluted to near invisibility, survived at meaningful proportions. That is the story that the ancient DNA is telling, a story of ecological specialization and geographic marginality that, combined, created refugia, where the oldest European ancestry could persist. And the Scottish Islands, at the far northwestern corner of the Atlantic fringe, were among the most effective of those refugia. Language leaves different kinds of evidence than genetics or archaeology. It leaves, primarily, other language. Words, grammars, sound patterns that can be compared between languages and analyzed for patterns of relationship. From those patterns, linguists reconstruct the history of language families and trace the movements of the people who spoke them. The linguistic history of the British Isles is, by the standards of the rest of Europe, unusually complex. It involves at least 4 major language changes in the historically or prehistorically attested period. A pre-Celtic language or languages that are now essentially unknown. Celtic languages, arriving in the Bronze or Iron Age. Latin, arriving with the Romans. And finally, Germanic languages, arriving with the Anglo-Saxons. And in the Northern Islands, Norse with the Vikings. Each of these transitions left traces in the modern language landscape, and those traces are distributed unevenly. Some places retain more of the older layers than others. Some communities switched languages repeatedly, sometimes losing the previous language entirely, sometimes maintaining elements of it in vocabulary or place names or grammatical structures that survived into the new tongue. The Scottish Islands sit at one of the most complex intersections of this multi-layered linguistic history. They have Gaelic, a Celtic language brought by Irish settlers in the early medieval period. Overlaid on that Gaelic layer in the Northern Isles, they have massive Norse influence, sometimes complete Norse replacement in the form of Norn before its extinction. Under the Gaelic, in place names and some vocabulary, there are traces of what may be Pictish, which may itself contain non-Celtic elements. And under all of that, theoretically, is the complete void of the pre-Celtic linguistic layer. The language or languages spoken in Scotland before the Celtic languages arrived. The tongue of the people who built the stone circles of Orkney and the cairns of Lewis and the brocks of the Northern Isles before any Celtic speaker had reached these shores. What might that pre-Celtic language have been? There are some intriguing candidates. Basque, as we have noted, is a language that has no demonstrable relationship to any other known tongue. Its presence in the Pyrenean Mountains at the Atlantic edge of Europe, in exactly the same kind of geographic refugium that we have been discussing, is widely understood to reflect the survival of a pre-Indo-European language in a region where Indo-European languages were unable to completely penetrate. The Basque language, in other words, may be the survivor, in one small corner of Europe, of a linguistic tradition that once extended across much of the Atlantic fringe. If the Basque language is a survivor of the pre-Indo-European linguistic landscape of Atlantic Europe, and if the Scottish island populations are genetically closely related to the Basque populations in carrying the same ancient ancestral component at elevated frequencies, then it is at least plausible to ask whether the pre-Celtic language of Scotland might have been related to Basque, whether the void under the Gaelic layer might be filled, at least partially, by something in the same linguistic family as Euskara. This is speculation. The academic consensus in linguistics is extremely cautious about such proposals, and with good reason. The methods for detecting linguistic relationship become unreliable at the kind of time depth we are discussing. 10,000 years of linguistic change is, in most circumstances, more than enough to erase all detectable evidence of common ancestry between two languages. Even if the pre-Celtic language of Scotland and the ancestor of modern Basque were once related, there is probably no recoverable linguistic evidence of that relationship in either the Pictish inscriptions or the modern Basque lexicon. But there is another angle of approach: place names. In many parts of the world, place names from older linguistic layers survive in the landscape even after the speaking community that named those places has vanished or switched to a different language. The names of rivers, in particular, are famous for their conservatism. River names are often the last linguistic traces of pre-conquest or pre-migration languages, surviving because the practical necessity of naming the local river supersedes the usual pressure to adopt the new language's vocabulary. In Britain, the river names that survive from the pre-Celtic period are not clearly attributable to any known language family. They are not Celtic. They are not Indo-European in any recoverable sense. They are simply there, unanalyzable relics of whatever was spoken before the Celts arrived, preserved because rivers needed names, even after the language that gave them those names was gone. In Scotland, and particularly in the Scottish Islands, the substrate of ancient place names under the Gaelic and Norse layers includes elements that have resisted etymological analysis in both those languages. Certain hill names, certain coastal feature names, certain names of lochs and headlands that the Norse settlers and the Gaelic settlers apparently adopted from the existing population rather than replacing with their own coinages. These adopted names, sometimes slightly modified to fit the phonology of the adopting language, are linguistic fossils, preserved impressions of a spoken sound from a language that no longer has any living speakers. Whether any of these fossil names can ever be connected to Basque, to Pictish, or to any other known or theorized pre-Celtic language of Europe is unlikely in practice, but not impossible in principle. The linguistic detective work is painstaking, and the results uncertain. But the effort of pursuing it is worthwhile, not because it will necessarily produce clear answers, but because the questions themselves illuminate something important about the depth of human presence in these landscapes. There is also the matter of grammar. Languages that have been in contact for long periods often show influence from older layers, not just in vocabulary, but in grammatical structure. When a population switches languages, they tend to impose patterns from their old language onto the new one. This is how contact features, grammatical patterns that do not reflect the historical development of a language from its ancestors, but rather the influence of a different language spoken alongside it, come to exist in languages that have otherwise descended clearly from a different source. Scottish Gaelic, when analysed carefully by Celtic linguists, shows certain grammatical features that do not have clear parallels in Irish Gaelic or in the other Celtic languages of Britain and Europe. Some of these features may reflect the influence of Norse, which was spoken in close contact with Gaelic in the Northern Isles for centuries, but others seem to predate the Norse contact period and have been attributed, by various researchers with varying degrees of confidence, to the influence of a non-Celtic substrate, the language or languages spoken by the people who were already in Scotland when the Gaelic settlers arrived. If those substrate features are genuine, if they really do reflect the influence of a pre-Celtic Scottish language on the Gaelic that displaced it, then they are an extraordinary survival. Grammatical patterns from a language last spoken, perhaps 2,000 years ago, still shaping the structure of the language spoken in the Outer Hebrides today. The ghost of the old tongue, preserved in the grammar of the new one. We cannot be certain of this. The substrate hypothesis in linguistics is always somewhat speculative, because contact influence and internal development can produce similar results and are not always distinguishable from each other. But the hypothesis is taken seriously by researchers who work on the Celtic languages and their history, and it is consistent with everything else we know about the deep ancestral connection between the Scottish island communities and the most ancient populations of Atlantic Europe. Language and genetics are separate systems. They respond to historical pressures in different ways and at different speeds. but they are both carried by the same people, and when they tell the same story, the convergent evidence is powerful. The Scottish Islands carry, in their genetics and their linguistic landscape, the most complex and the most ancient stratigraphic record of human presence anywhere in Britain. The layers go down deeper than in most places, and more of the oldest material has survived the millennia. It is a record that is still being read, still being understood, still yielding surprises to the researchers who have the tools and the patience to look carefully. What it says, in both genetic and linguistic terms, is that the people here are very old, not frozen in amber, not unchanged, not the same as they were 10,000 years ago, but connected, through more unbroken threads than almost anyone else in Europe, to what was here at the beginning. Every archaeological site is a conversation between the people who lived there and the people who find their traces. The conversation is asymmetrical. The people who lived there could not have anticipated what questions would be asked of their remains. The people asking the questions can only ask what the remains make available. The exchange is incomplete on both sides, and the incompleteness is itself informative. The archaeological record of the Scottish Islands is among the richest and most extensively studied in Britain. Partly this is because of the exceptional preservation conditions. Cold, wet, acidic soils are not always ideal for preserving organic materials, but they do preserve certain things, particularly waterlogged materials, extraordinarily well. Partly it is because the islands have been intensively surveyed and excavated since the 19th century, producing a dataset that rivals anywhere in Europe for its temporal depth and regional coverage. And partly it is because the islands reward archaeological attention so generously. There is simply more per square kilometre here, it sometimes seems, than elsewhere. The Neolithic archaeology of Orkney alone would justify the attention. We have already mentioned the great monuments, the Ring of Brodgar, the stones of Stennis, Maeshowe, Skara Brae, but these are only the most famous nodes in a much denser network of Neolithic activity. The Ness of Brodgar, a site being excavated over many field seasons that has revealed a large complex of Neolithic buildings of a kind not seen anywhere else in Britain, is currently transforming our understanding of what Orkney was like at the height of the megalithic period. The buildings are large, well-constructed, and elaborate in their internal organization. They contain evidence of feasting on a scale that implies gatherings of people from considerable distances. They have produced artifacts of kinds found across the entire length of Britain, demonstrating connections with communities from Cornwall to the Highlands. Orkney, in the late Neolithic, was not peripheral, it was central. It was a place where people came from far away, for reasons we can only partially reconstruct, to participate in ceremonies and exchanges that were significant enough to be worth long and difficult journeys. The monuments they left were designed to last, and they have. 5,000 years later, they are still there, still standing, still astronomically aligned, still marking the passage of light through the year in the way their builders intended. What does this tell us about the people who built them? It tells us they were organized. They could coordinate labor on a large scale over long periods. They were astronomically sophisticated. They understood, with precision, the movements of the sun and the moon, and could predict the moments when those movements would produce the effects they sought: the midwinter light entering the Maeshowe chamber, the alignment of the Brodgar ring with particular celestial events. They were part of a network that extended the full length of Britain and connected the far northern islands to communities in the south. It also tells us something about their social structure. The scale of the Brodgar and Stennis monuments and the Ness of Brodgar complex implies a society with the capacity to organize large-scale communal labor. But the Neolithic communities of Orkney were not stratified in the way that later Bronze Age and Iron Age societies would be. There is little evidence of extreme hierarchy in the burial record. The chambered cairns that contain human remains in Orkney are communal structures, built to hold the bones of many individuals over multiple generations, not individual elite burials. This suggests a social organization where collective identity and shared ancestry mattered more than individual status, where the community, rather than the exceptional individual, was the primary social unit. This is consistent with the broader pattern of Neolithic Atlantic societies. The megalithic tradition along the Atlantic coast is, as far as we can tell, a tradition of collective monument building, organized around communal ceremonies and shared relationships with the dead, rather than around the aggrandizement of individual leaders. The monuments are not tombs of kings, they are houses of ancestors, places where the community maintained its connection to those who had gone before. There is something deeply meaningful about that, in the context of the story we have been telling. The people who built these monuments were themselves the descendants of survivors, of communities that had endured the flooding of Doggerland and established themselves on the islands and coastlines of the Atlantic fringe. The emphasis on ancestors, on maintaining connection to those who came before, on building structures that would preserve that connection for generations to come, may reflect something of their own experience of loss and continuity. The awareness that what you have can be taken, that the world can change catastrophically, that the connection to those who came before is fragile and must be deliberately maintained. The chambered cairns of Orkney and the Hebrides were not just burial structures, they were memory structures, places where the physical remains of the dead were kept accessible, where the bones of ancestors could be handled and rearranged in ceremonies whose precise meaning we cannot recover, but whose function we can guess. They were places where the living maintained their relationship with the dead, where the continuity of community across generations was enacted and reenacted. In that function, they are perhaps not so different from the oral traditions that maintained community memory in later centuries without benefit of stone architecture. The Selkie stories, the seasonal ceremonies, the naming practices that connected individuals to their ancestors, the bardic traditions that preserved genealogies stretching back into the mythological past. All of these are attempts to do what the chambered cairns did, to maintain connection, to resist the erosion of memory by time. The people who built Maeshowe and the people who told the first Selkie stories and the people whose genetic legacy survives in the modern communities of Lewis and Harris and Shetland are the same people, separated by millennia and many layers of cultural transformation, but connected by an unbroken biological and, in some sense, a cultural chain. The chain has been stretched and twisted, and sometimes nearly broken, but it has not been severed. The archaeology of the Scottish Islands is the archaeology of that chain. Every excavation reveals another link. Every ancient genome tells another part of the story of how the chain was forged and how it survived. Every standing stone, weathered by the Atlantic rain for 5,000 years, is a monument not just to the people who raised it, but to the extraordinary fact that people have been raising things here, have been marking their presence here, have been insisting on their connection to this landscape for longer than almost anyone in Europe. The deep archaeology and the deep genetics converge on the same conclusion. The Scottish Islands are old in a way that most places in the world are not. Old in a way that shows in the landscape and in the people and in the stories they tell about themselves. Old in a way that deserves recognition and, more than recognition, care. We have mentioned several times the maritime character of the Scottish island communities and its deep historical roots. Let us spend some time with this, because it is central to understanding not just how these communities survived, but what made them distinctive, what gave them their particular character, what shaped the faces and the bodies and the psychological orientation of the people who grew up here. The sea is not, to island people, what it is to most inhabitants of continental Europe. For most people, in most of history, the sea has been a boundary, a limit, the place where the land ends and the known world stops. To the people of the Hebrides and Orkney and Shetland, the sea has never been that. It has been a road, a connection, the medium through which their social world extended and through which they maintained their relationship with the broader human community. This is a different cognitive relationship to water than most people have. It requires a different kind of attention, a different set of perceptual skills, a different tolerance for the unpredictable and the dangerous. People who depend on the sea develop, over generations, both culturally and perhaps to some degree genetically, adaptations to that dependence. They read the water differently from land-based people. They feel the changes in wind and current and swell that are invisible to those who spend their lives on dry ground. They have an instinctive calibration of risk that is tuned to a different set of dangers than the risks of the agricultural world. The Mesolithic communities of Atlantic Europe, those ancient hunter-gatherers whose genetic legacy is preserved most completely in the Scottish Islands, were fundamentally marine-adapted communities. The archaeological evidence from their sites, which exist along the Atlantic coast from Portugal to Scandinavia, shows an overwhelming dependence on marine resources. Shellfish middens, enormous accumulations of shells and bones from meals eaten over centuries, mark their settlements. Fish bones, sea mammal bones, and seabird bones are found alongside the shells. These communities ate from the sea and understood the sea in ways that farming communities never needed to. Their boats, whatever form they took, were almost certainly the most important technology they possessed. We have almost no direct evidence of what those boats looked like. Wooden boats do not survive 10,000 years except under very exceptional conditions of preservation. What we have instead is circumstantial evidence. The distribution of their settlements on islands that would have been completely inaccessible without watercraft. The presence of obsidian and other stone tools from island sources on mainland sites, demonstrating regular crossings of bodies of water. The bones of deep-water fish at sites that are only accessible by sea. These people were seafarers, not in the dramatic sense of long ocean voyages to unknown continents, though some of their descendant communities would eventually achieve that too, but in the everyday sense of people for whom getting into a boat and crossing a stretch of water was as unremarkable as walking to the next valley was for their inland contemporaries. The sea was their road, and they travelled it with the casual confidence that comes from deep familiarity. That tradition has never entirely left the Scottish Islands. It has been modified, of course, by thousands of years of subsequent history. The boats have changed in form, from whatever skin or wooden vessels the Mesolithic people used to the clinker-built Norse craft that replaced them, to the later open wooden boats of the half-fishing era, to the modern fiberglass hulls, with outboard motors that sit in island harbours today. But the fundamental relationship with the sea, the understanding of it as a road rather than a barrier, has been continuous. The half-fishing of Shetland deserves particular mention here because it represents, as recently as the 19th century, a maritime tradition of extraordinary intensity. Half is a Norse word for ocean, and the half-fishing was the practice of going far out to sea, beyond the sheltering influence of the islands, to fish for cod and ling in the deep water. The men who did it went in small, open boats called six-erns, six-oared craft about 30 feet long, with no engine and no shelter. They rowed or sailed up to 40 miles from shore, set their long lines, fished through the night, and rowed or sailed back. In bad weather, many of them did not make it back. The casualty rate in the half-fishing was appalling by modern standards. Storms that came up quickly in the North Atlantic could overwhelm the small boats before the fishermen could make for shelter. Entire crews were lost. The Shetland landscape is dotted with memorials to men who did not return from the half. Yet the fishing continued, generation after generation, because there was no alternative. The islands could not support their population from agriculture alone. The sea was not optional. What the half-fishing produced, over the generations in which it was practiced, was a culture of maritime competence and maritime fatalism that is unlike anything found in agricultural communities. The men who went to the half, and the women who waited for them to return, had a relationship with uncertainty and loss that was built into the fabric of daily life. It shaped the emotional register of the culture, the particular combination of stoicism and warmth and dry humour and depth of feeling that characterises the Shetland and Orkney personality as often described by observers. It shaped the music, the ballads of the sea and loss that are among the most distinctive products of the Northern Isles' cultural tradition. It shaped the stories, the legends of sea monsters and drowned men returning from the deep and the strange beings that live between the human world and the ocean world. All of this is continuous with the Mesolithic maritime tradition. Not in every specific detail, of course. Thousands of years of history intervene between the skin-boat seafarers of 10,000 years ago and the six-ern fishermen of the 19th century. But the underlying orientation, the cognitive and cultural adaptation to a life organized around the sea, persists. It persists in the people whose ancestors have been living from the sea in this corner of the world for longer than almost any other community on Earth. There is also a physical dimension to this maritime adaptation that is worth noting. Marine-adapted populations that have depended primarily on seafood for their caloric intake over long periods, often show distinctive physiological profiles that reflect this dietary specialization. The omega-3 fatty acids abundant in marine diets affect cardiovascular function, immune system regulation, and neurological development. Populations with long histories of high marine food consumption may show genetic adaptations in the enzymes that metabolize these fatty acids, making them more efficient at converting the dietary fatty acids into the forms most useful for physiology. There is preliminary evidence that Atlantic fringe populations, including Scottish island communities, show genetic variants in fatty acid metabolism pathways that are more common than in continental European populations. This is not yet a thoroughly established finding, but it is biologically plausible and consistent with the deep maritime history of these communities. Natural selection, operating over thousands of generations of a high seafood diet, might be expected to favor variants that improve the processing of those dietary inputs. If this is confirmed by further research, it would represent a beautiful symmetry. The same ancient maritime tradition that shaped the genetic composition of the Scottish island communities by preserving the ancient Mesolithic ancestry in elevated proportions may also have shaped specific functional genetic variants through selection on dietary metabolism. The sea would have left its mark not just in the ancestral components of the genome, but in the specific genes that govern how the body processes what the sea provides. The Scottish Islanders would then be maritime people not just culturally and historically, but biologically, in ways that go all the way down to the molecular level. Their cells would be tuned to a diet that their ancestors ate for millennia. The fish and shellfish that they eat today, that their parents ate, that their grandparents ate, all the way back through the recorded centuries and the unrecorded millennia to the Mesolithic shore camps of Atlantic Europe, would be food that their bodies have been specifically optimized by evolution to receive. That is a remarkable thing to contemplate, the body as a record of its own history, the cells as a library that writes itself through the experience of generations and preserves that writing for the next generation to inherit. Every fisherman who pulls a creel from the water around these islands is, in some cellular sense, enacting a genetic memory 10,000 years deep. Here is something that should startle you, if the full weight of it lands properly. Before the Romans arrived in Britain, before any Mediterranean civilization had reached the northwestern corner of Europe, before the Phoenicians, before the Greeks, before any of the literate civilizations of the ancient world had established regular contact with the British Isles, there was already a functioning long-distance trade network connecting the communities of the Atlantic coast from the Mediterranean to the Scottish Islands. We know this because of what archaeologists find in the ground. Objects that could only have come from very distant places, in contexts that predate any historically documented contact between those places. Amber from the Baltic coast, found in Neolithic and Bronze Age deposits in Britain and Ireland. Bronze artifacts whose metallic composition matches sources in the continental Europe and beyond. Pottery styles that show clear connections across what seem, from a land perspective, like enormous distances. And most strikingly, objects of a kind not made locally, whose raw materials are not available locally, that could only have arrived through some form of long-distance exchange. The implications of this trade network are profound, and they are still being worked out by researchers. The conventional picture of prehistoric Atlantic Europe as a collection of isolated local communities, each developing its own culture more or less independently with only occasional contacts with neighbors, is simply wrong. The archaeological evidence points instead to a relatively integrated maritime world, in which communities separated by hundreds or even thousands of kilometers of coastline maintained ongoing connections through trade, through the movement of people, and through the sharing of ideas and technologies. The sea was the highway, and the people of the Scottish Islands were not at the end of the highway, the distant terminus of a network centered somewhere more important. They were part of the network. They participated in exchanges that connected them to Ireland, to Wales, to Brittany, to Iberia, and through those connections to the broader world of the ancient Atlantic. The grooved ware pottery tradition, a distinctive style of ceramics that appears in the late Neolithic of the British Isles, provides one of the most striking examples. Grooved ware was first identified at Skara Brae on Orkney, where it is found in the oldest and most extensively studied Neolithic village in Britain, but it is not confined to Orkney. It appears at sites across Britain and Ireland, including at Stonehenge and its environs in Wiltshire, in contexts that make it clear the pottery style spread southward from Scotland rather than northward from England. Orkney, in other words, was not a recipient of southern influence, but a source of influence that spread to the south. This reversal of the conventional assumption about cultural flow in prehistoric Britain is significant. It implies that the communities of the Scottish Islands were not peripheral to the intellectual and cultural developments of Neolithic Britain. They were, in some periods, at the leading edge of those developments. The ideas that shaped the megalithic tradition of Britain may have been developed or elaborated in the Scottish Islands before spreading south. The people who built the monuments of the Thames Valley and Salisbury Plain may have been working from a template developed in Orkney. The Atlantic trade route also had a dimension that goes beyond the material exchange of goods and ideas. It facilitated the movement of people, not just merchants or emissaries, but settlers, spouses, skilled craftspeople, specialists of all kinds. The genetic evidence for the Atlantic megalithic communities, which we have discussed, showing that they were more closely related to each other than to contemporary inland populations, is consistent with a pattern of preferential marriage within the maritime network. People who lived along the sea routes married other people from the sea routes, maintaining biological as well as cultural connections across enormous distances. This pattern of maritime endogamy, if we want to use the technical term, would have had interesting genetic consequences. It would have maintained a distinct Atlantic population that was, as a whole, more genetically unified than would have been expected given the geographic distances involved, while simultaneously being more distinct from inland populations than proximity alone would predict. The genetic signal that modern researchers detect in Atlantic fringe populations, the shared ancient ancestry, the similar frequencies of ancient lineages, the clustering together of populations from Portugal to Orkney when the analysis has enough resolution, may partly reflect this ancient pattern of preferential marriage within the maritime network. The Scottish island communities, at the northern end of this network, were connected to the broader Atlantic world in ways that shaped both their genetics and their culture. They were not isolated. They were connected in a way that was different from the way inland communities were connected, through the sea rather than through the land, through a network that stretched down the entire Atlantic coast of Europe. Their distinctiveness from inland European populations is not the distinctiveness of isolation. It is the distinctiveness of a different kind of connection. They were part of a world that most people today have forgotten existed. Some researchers have speculated, with varying degrees of evidence, about whether the Atlantic maritime network extended even further, whether the seagoing communities of the Atlantic coast ever made the leap across the open ocean to the Americas. The North Atlantic is not a trivial crossing, but the Norse did it in the 10th century, sailing from Greenland to Newfoundland in ships that were not fundamentally different in their construction principles from the boats that had been used on the Atlantic coast for millennia. Did anyone make that crossing before the Norse? The question is contentious, and the evidence is thin, but it is not an absurd question. The genetic evidence from some Native American populations shows signals that have been interpreted as possible pre-Columbian contact with populations from somewhere in the North Atlantic or Western Europe. These signals are controversial, and their interpretation is disputed, but they have not been completely dismissed by serious researchers. If there was pre-Columbian contact across the North Atlantic, the most likely route would have been the one that island-hopping sailors have used since the Norse period, from Norway to Iceland to Greenland to the Canadian coast. And the most likely participants would have been people with exactly the kind of deep maritime tradition and fearless relationship with the open sea that characterizes the island communities of Scotland's Atlantic fringe. This is speculation. Let us be clear about that. The evidence is not sufficient to make a confident claim. But it is the kind of speculation that the deep maritime history of the Atlantic communities makes at least worth taking seriously, rather than dismissing out of hand on the assumption that prehistoric people could not have managed what we know historical people did manage, with less sophisticated technology. The sea, for these communities, was never a limit. It was always an invitation. We are coming to the end of the story, or at least to the part of it that we can currently see. The story itself is not ending. It continues in the daily lives of the people who live on these islands today, in the children who are growing up speaking Gaelic or English or both, in the fishermen who set their gear in the same waters where their ancestors set theirs 10,000 years ago, in the researchers who are sequencing genomes and excavating sites and analyzing place names, adding new chapters to the archive every year. What will the future of the Scottish island communities look like? It is impossible to know. The demographic trends of the present are not encouraging for the survival of the traditional community structures that have maintained these populations for so long. Depopulation continues, young people leave, the language contracts, the traditional knowledge is not always being transmitted. But demographic trends are not destiny. The communities of the Scottish Islands have survived things before that looked, in the moment, like they might be terminal. The clearances were a genuine catastrophe. They depopulated entire landscapes and severed the direct connections between communities and their land. And yet something survived. The people who remained, and in some cases the people who left and maintained their connection to the islands through identity and cultural practice even from a distance, kept something alive. The Gaelic language revival, while not sufficient to reverse the long-term decline, has produced genuine results. There are young people in the Western Isles today who speak Gaelic as their first language, who are raising children in Gaelic, who are creating new Gaelic cultural production in music and literature and digital media. The language is alive in a way that it was not certain to be a generation ago. Whether it will still be alive in the communities of Lewis and Harris a century from now, no one can say. But it is alive now, and that matters. The archaeological and genetic research that has been the subject of so much of our discussion tonight is itself a form of preservation. Every genome sequence, every excavation report, every linguistic analysis adds to the archive of information about these communities and their deep history. Even if the communities themselves were to change beyond recognition in coming generations, that archive would remain. The story would not be entirely lost, even if the living connection to it became less direct. But there is something irreplaceable about the living connection, about the fact that right now, today, there are people in Lewis and Shetland and Orkney who are the biological descendants of the people who built the stone circles, who are the genetic heirs of the survivors of Doggerland, who carry in their faces and their cells and their cultural memory something that has been continuous in this place for 10,000 years. That living connection, once broken, cannot be reconstructed from an archive. You can know about it, you cannot reconstitute it. This is why the human dimension of the genetic story matters. The research that identifies the Scottish island populations as genetically distinctive is not just interesting science, it is evidence of something that has value beyond the scientific, a form of human diversity, a living connection to the deep past that deserves to be understood and honoured and supported by the broader society that benefits from knowing it exists. The people of the Scottish Islands are not curiosities. They are not subjects for study, objects of genetic interest, who happen also to live in a striking landscape and maintain a fascinating culture. They are communities with their own needs and aspirations and difficulties, who happen to have a deeper connection to the human past of this part of the world than almost any comparable community in Europe. That combination deserves more than academic interest. It deserves practical support. What form that support might take is a political and social question that goes beyond what this story can answer. But the story can at least make the case for why it matters. The Scottish island communities are unique in ways that are genuinely significant, not just culturally or aesthetically, but historically and biologically, and in terms of what their existence reveals about the deepest roots of human presence in Europe. Their continuation matters. Their distinctiveness deserves protection. Their deep history deserves to be known not just by geneticists and archaeologists, but by the people themselves, and by everyone else who lives on this continent and who is, in some sense, the heir of the same vast human story. The Doggerlanders, who found refuge on the high ground of the Atlantic Islands when their world flooded, could not have known that their descendants, 10,000 years later, would still be there. They could not have known that the DNA their cells carried would be sequenced by researchers in the 21st century and would tell a story that would illuminate the deepest layers of European prehistory. They could not have known that the survival of their ancestral bloodline in these remote and demanding islands would be recognized as something remarkable. They could not have known any of that. They were just people. People who had lost their world and found a new one on the edge of the Atlantic, and who had done what human beings do when their world is taken from them. They had survived. They had kept going. They had raised children and told stories and built monuments and fished the same waters and maintained their connection to each other and to the landscape that was now their home. That is the real miracle, if we want to call it that, not the genetics, not the ancient ancestry, not the preservations of old blood types and cranial morphologies and haplogroup frequencies. The miracle is simply that people kept going, that the thread was not broken. That 10,000 years later, something of those ancient people still looks out at the Atlantic from the cliffs of Lewis, still feels the North Sea wind on its face from the hill above Lerwick, still recognizes in the particular quality of light on a winter morning, something that is not foreign, that is home in a way that goes deeper than any remembered history can reach. That is what it means to be old, in the truest sense. Not to be ancient in some museum sense. To be rooted, in a way that the word rooted barely captures, in a place and a lineage that goes back before the beginning of what we usually call history, all the way to the beginning of human presence in this corner of the world. The Scottish Islanders are old. They are the oldest people in this landscape, and the story of their antiquity is one of the most extraordinary stories in all of European prehistory. It deserves to be told. It deserves to be heard. And now that you have heard it, perhaps you will see those faces differently if you ever encounter them, not as exotic or unusual or merely interesting, as ancestral, as ancient, as the living face of a world that most of Europe has forgotten. And so you have it. The real reason the islanders of Scotland look different from every other European. Not a simple answer. Never a simple answer when you are asking about the deep human past, but a true one, or as close to true as the current state of human knowledge can bring us. They are the heirs of Doggerland. They are the last keepers of an Atlantic ancestry that the rest of Europe lost when the Great Migration swept across the continent. They are the biological continuation of the people who watched the sea rise, found high ground, and survived. They are the inheritors of the Mesolithic world, of the megalithic tradition, of the Atlantic maritime network, of the Norse seafaring culture, of the Gaelic bardic tradition, of everything that accumulated on these islands over 10,000 years of continuous human presence. The genetic distinctiveness that researchers measure, the elevated WHG ancestry component, the ancient haplogroup frequencies, the particular cranial morphologies, the unusual blood type distributions, these are not anomalies. They are the signature of survival. The mark left on living people by the persistence, against enormous odds, of an ancient human community in one of the most challenging and most beautiful environments in all of Europe. The next time you look at a photograph of the Atlantic at dusk, somewhere off the Hebridean coast where the light turns the water to copper and the cliffs go black against the sky, think about how long humans have been looking at that view, not from the edge of things, from the center of their own world, a world that the sea created and the sea almost took away, and the sea then surrounded and preserved in its cold and demanding way for longer than almost anyone knows to look for. The stone circles are still standing, the haplogroups are still circulating, the language is still being spoken, however quietly, however precarious, in the homes and the schools and the radio broadcasts of the Western Isles. The faces are still there, looking out at the water with that particular quality of attention that comes from knowing the water in the way that only a very long intimacy can produce. The thread has not been broken. The story is not over. And here, now, in whatever quiet, dark place you are inhabiting while you listen to this, you have been, for a few hours, part of that story too. You have followed the thread back through the genetics and the archaeology and the folklore and the geology to a place before any of those disciplines existed, to a shore where the water was rising and the world was ending, and some people, by chance or courage or simply the blind persistence of life, found high ground. The world they lost is still down there under the water. The people they became are still here above it. Rest now. The deep past is not a threat. It is a foundation. The oldest foundations hold the most weight and go down the furthest, and the building above them is strange and wonderful and full of things that even the best instruments we have made can only partially read. Sleep well, wherever you are listening from. The same North Atlantic that shaped the faces of the Scottish Islanders has been shaping this world for a very long time. You are part of it too, in ways you cannot fully see from the inside. We all are, all the way down. Between the late Neolithic and the full emergence of the Bronze Age, there was a period that archaeologists sometimes call the Copper Age or Chalcolithic, a transitional era when people first began working metal, but before the alloy of copper and tin that defines the Bronze Age had become widespread. This period, which in Western Europe occupies roughly the centuries between 3,500 and 2,500 BC, is in some ways the pivot on which the whole story of Atlantic Europe turns. It is the moment when the ancient maritime network of the megalithic builders begins to be succeeded by something new, something that will eventually bring the Yamnaya-related genetics and the Indo-European language family to the western edge of the continent. The people most closely associated with this transition in Western Europe are known archaeologically as the Bell-Beaker people, named for the distinctive inverted bell-shaped pottery vessels that mark their culture across an enormous swath of Europe from the Iberian Peninsula to Poland and from Morocco to Scotland. The Bell-Beaker culture is one of the most extensively studied in prehistoric European archaeology, not least because it shows up almost everywhere, appearing in contexts from Portugal to Bohemia within a relatively short period, and raising immediate questions about how it spread and who the people were who carried it. The ancient DNA evidence has produced a remarkable and somewhat unexpected answer. The Bell-Beaker culture spread in two different ways. In Central Europe, it spread primarily as a movement of people, carried by populations with substantial steppe ancestry, who moved westward as part of the broader expansion we have discussed. But in Western Europe, in Iberia and France and Britain and Ireland, the Bell-Beaker culture appears to have spread initially as a cultural exchange, moving along existing trade networks, without a large accompanying movement of people. The pottery style, the particular burial customs, the metalworking traditions, these spread across the Atlantic seaboard first as ideas, adopted by existing communities who maintained their own genetic character. Then something changed. In Britain specifically, around 2500 BC, the Bell-Beaker culture arrives accompanied, in the genetic record, by a dramatic shift in population ancestry. The people buried in the earliest Bell-Beaker contexts in Britain show dramatically higher levels of steppe ancestry than the previous inhabitants. The transition is rapid, within a few centuries, and the magnitude of the genetic replacement is substantial. Researchers studying this period have estimated that the genetic ancestry of the British population changed by 40 to 50% within a few hundred years, a change of a speed and scale that implies significant population movement rather than simply cultural adoption. This is the population event that most dramatically reshaped British genetics in the period we are discussing. It was a genuine replacement, or near replacement, of the existing Neolithic population by Bell-Beaker-associated people with substantial steppe ancestry. And it affected virtually every part of Britain. Virtually. But not every part equally. And the places where it had the least impact, where the pre-Bell-Beaker population maintained the highest proportions of its ancient ancestry, were precisely the places we have been discussing: the remote north, the Atlantic Islands, the communities that were geographically most difficult to reach and that had been, as we have argued, the most persistently distinct from the mainland agricultural communities throughout the Neolithic. In Orkney, the Bell-Beaker transition was later and less dramatic than in southern Britain. The Neolithic traditions persisted longer. The genetic shift was less abrupt. The ancient megalithic culture, with its communal tombs and its astronomical monuments and its pottery traditions that had originated in Orkney and spread southward, continued in recognizable form after it had been substantially displaced further south. Orkney was not untouched by the Bell-Beaker phenomenon, but it was touched later and less completely. In the Outer Hebrides, the picture is similar. The transition to new cultural forms was gradual. The existing communities, with their deep roots in the ancient Atlantic tradition, absorbed new influences without being demographically overwhelmed by them. The later Bronze Age communities of Lewis and Harris show the new cultural forms, the new metal technologies, the new burial customs. But they also show genetic continuity with the Neolithic communities that preceded them, more continuity than their counterparts in most of southern Britain. This is one more layer in the story of why the Scottish island populations are distinctive. Every major demographic event in the prehistory of Western Europe, the farming revolution, the Bell-Beaker expansion, the Bronze Age transformations, hit the Scottish islands later and with less force than it hit the rest of Britain. Every time, the communities of the Atlantic fringe absorbed some of the incoming influence while maintaining more of what was there before than almost anywhere else. The cumulative effect of that repeated pattern is what we are still measuring today in the genetic distinctiveness of these populations. It is not the result of a single event or a single period of isolation. It is the result of 10,000 years of being, consistently and repeatedly, just far enough from the center that the waves of change arrived attenuated, their demographic force reduced by distance and by the difficulty of the maritime approaches. The Scottish Islands were never entirely isolated. They were never fully cut off from the broader currents of European history. But they were consistently, persistently, sufficiently marginal that those currents flowed around them in ways that left more of the deep ancestral sediment undisturbed than anywhere else. The Bell Beaker period is interesting for another reason that connects to the broader theme of this story. It is the period when the first clear evidence of horses appears in the British archaeological record. The Bell Beaker associated populations who brought steppe ancestry to Britain also brought with them the horse cultures of the Pontic-Caspian steppe, the pastoral ways of life organized around mounted mobility that would come to define the Bronze Age across much of Europe. The horse did not reach the Scottish Islands on the same timeline as it reached southern Britain. The remote North and the Western Islands remained, for longer, oriented toward the sea rather than the land, toward the maritime networks that had connected Atlantic communities for millennia, rather than the horse-based land mobility that was transforming the interior. This is another dimension of the contrast between the island communities and the rest of Britain, not just a genetic contrast, but a technological and economic contrast that reinforced the separateness of the island world from the continental-influenced mainland. The people of the Scottish Islands in the Bronze Age were living in a world that was simultaneously part of the broader European Bronze Age, connected through trade and cultural exchange to the wider transformations of that period, and also still deeply rooted in the older maritime tradition of the Atlantic Neolithic. They were not stuck in the past. They were making their own synthesis of old and new, in a way that was shaped by their geography, their ancestral connections, and the particular resources and challenges of their island environment. That synthesis is still visible today. In the genetics, in the archaeology, in the cultural traditions that have survived to the present. The Scottish Islands are not a museum of the past. They are a living community that has, over 10,000 years, developed a particular and extraordinary relationship with its history, its landscape, and the deep ancestral roots that connect it to a world before history began. Here is something unusual to consider. The way that communities relate to animals, particularly birds, often encodes information about the deep past that is not available from other sources. Bird lore, the accumulated knowledge and mythology that human communities develop around the birds they live with, can be extraordinarily conservative, preserving observations and cultural responses to specific species that reflect relationships going back centuries or millennia. In the Scottish Islands, the bird lore is ancient and elaborate in ways that reflect the deep maritime character of the communities. The knowledge of seabirds, their behavior, their movements, their seasonal patterns, embedded in the traditional culture and language of the island communities, represents an archive of ecological observation that accumulated over a very long time and that is still, in fragments, accessible. Consider the relationship between island communities and the gannet, the large seabird that breeds on the dramatic cliff stacks off the Atlantic coasts. The gannet was not merely an object of observation but a resource, a food source, and a navigational indicator. Gannet colonies were known and managed by island communities, and the specific techniques for harvesting young gannets, developed over generations and encoded in traditional practice, were both practical technology and cultural knowledge of the highest order. The names given to different gannet colonies in the Gaelic tradition, the stories told about the gannets, the ceremonial dimensions of the gannet harvest on places like Sula Scare, where men from Ness in Lewis still make an annual voyage to harvest young gannets under a traditional license that predates any written legal framework. All of this reflects a relationship between human communities and a specific animal population that has been continuous for longer than we can directly document. The gannet harvest of Sula Scare is, in its essentials, a Mesolithic practice, not in its specific legal and cultural form, which has accumulated layers of historical overlay, but in its fundamental character, a group of men from an island community making a voyage to a remote sea stack to harvest a seabird resource, Using traditional knowledge of bird behavior and traditional techniques developed over generations, it is doing what the Mesolithic coastal communities of the Atlantic have always done. It is the living continuation of a practice that is at least as old as the ancient maritime tradition we have been tracing, and possibly older. The wren, the tiny brown bird whose flight seems barely capable of carrying it from hedge to hedge, plays a dramatically different role in Scottish island bird lore. In the Northern and Western Islands, the wren is associated with an ancient and widespread tradition that may be among the oldest in the British Isles. It was once customary, particularly on the Isle of Man and in parts of Ireland and some Scottish communities, to hunt the wren on a specific day in the calendar, usually the first day of the new year or the day after Christmas, in a ceremony whose details varied, but whose basic structure was broadly consistent. The wren hunt, whatever its precise origin, is old enough that its origins cannot be traced, and the explanations that communities offered for it varied widely. Some researchers have suggested that the wren hunt tradition reflects an extremely old ceremonial practice, possibly going back to the pre-Celtic period, in which the wren played a role in winter ritual that has been partially preserved and heavily layered with later cultural additions. The argument for great antiquity is not based on any documentary evidence, which would be impossible to obtain for something this old, but on the combination of the tradition's wide distribution across Atlantic fringe communities, its association with specific calendar dates that may reflect pre-Christian and possibly pre-agricultural seasonal divisions, and its distinctive quality of preservation in exactly the communities, the Atlantic fringe, that have most consistently maintained older cultural patterns. Whether or not this specific argument is correct, the broader point stands. The bird lore of the Scottish Islands, like the genetic composition of their human populations and the linguistic fossils embedded in their place names, is a multi-layered archive that accumulates information from many different periods and preserves the oldest layers in fragments and traces that require careful attention to read. The eagle, to move to a different example, was once a significant presence in the Scottish island landscape and features in the traditional knowledge and mythology of the communities that lived alongside it. The white-tailed eagle, the sea eagle, was the largest bird of prey in the British Isles and has been recently reintroduced to Scotland after centuries of extinction driven by human persecution. The golden eagle still survives in parts of the Highlands and Islands. Both species feature in the traditional knowledge systems of the island communities in ways that reflect long coexistence. In Gaelic tradition, the eagle is associated with great antiquity. The word for eagle, io appears in traditional poetry and stories in contexts that emphasize its age, its longevity, its connection to a time before human memory. There is a Gaelic poem, preserved in oral tradition and eventually written down, that uses the comparative longevity of the salmon, the stag, the blackbird, the oak, and the eagle as a way of measuring the depth of mythological time. The eagle is always the oldest, the one who remembers what everything else has forgotten. Is this simply poetic convention? Perhaps. But the association between eagles and extreme antiquity, in a tradition that places particular value on connections to the deep past, may also reflect the genuine ecological relationship between eagle populations and the human communities that have lived alongside them for thousands of years. Eagles are long-lived birds. An eagle that a human community observed could have been the same individual bird they had observed 20 or 30 years earlier. The sense of the eagle as ancient, as connected to a past beyond human memory, may have been reinforced by the genuine experience of knowing individual eagles across much of a human lifetime. What the bird lore of the Scottish Islands encodes, in its richest and most ancient layers, is an attentiveness to the natural world that is genuinely different from the kind of attentiveness that can be learned from books or from brief visits to a landscape. It is the attentiveness of people who have lived so intimately with specific animals in specific places over so many generations that the animals have become part of the community's understanding of itself, of its history, of its place in the world. That attentiveness is itself an archive. It contains information about the behavior of specific animal populations, about ecological patterns, about seasonal rhythms and long-term changes in the landscape, that is not available from any other source. And it is concentrated, like so much else in this story, in the communities that have maintained continuous presence in these landscapes for the longest time. The people of the Scottish Islands know things about the natural world of the North Atlantic that are not in any scientific database, because no one has had the time or the funding or the sustained presence in these specific places to collect that information systematically. They know it because they have been here, watching and learning and accumulating knowledge for 10,000 years. That knowledge, like the genes, like the language, like the archaeology, is part of what makes them different from everyone else in Europe. And like those other forms of knowledge, it is at risk of being lost before it can be properly understood. There is a concept in evolutionary biology and population genetics called a bottleneck. It refers to a dramatic reduction in the size of a population, caused by some catastrophic event, famine or disease or displacement or climatic disruption, that reduces the total number of individuals to a fraction of its previous size. The genetic consequences of a bottleneck are significant and long-lasting. When a large population is suddenly compressed to a small one, only the genetic variants present in the survivors continue. Many variants that were present in the original population are lost. The survivor's genetic composition becomes the foundation from which the subsequent population grows, and because the founding group was small, the subsequent population shows less genetic diversity than the original, with certain variants appearing at high frequency, not because they were advantageous, but simply because the founders who happened to carry them were the ones who survived. The drowning of Doggerland was almost certainly accompanied by one of the most severe genetic bottlenecks in the history of the populations that are now the Scottish island communities. We have very little direct evidence for the size of the Mesolithic population of the Greater Doggerland region before the flooding began, but by any reasonable estimate, the number of people who survived the flooding and reached the high ground of what is now Scotland's Atlantic coast and islands must have been a small fraction of the original population. Most of the people who lived on the Doggerland plain, in the river valleys and along the rich coastlines of the pre-flooding landscape, did not make it. The people who did make it were not a random sample of the original population. They were the ones who happened to be in the right place, on the high ground or on the island margins, when the water came. They were the ones whose communities had already established themselves on the resistant geology of the Atlantic fringe. They were, in other words, already a non-random subset of the broader Doggerlander population, selected not by any characteristic of their own, but by the accident of their location. The genetic consequences of this bottleneck are still visible today. The Scottish island populations show lower genetic diversity than most comparable European communities of similar size, a hallmark of bottleneck ancestry. They show elevated frequencies of certain genetic variants that, in the broader European context, are relatively rare, consistent with the founder effect that follows a bottleneck when a small founding population expands to refill the niche left by the catastrophe. They show patterns of genetic clustering that suggest the modern communities descend from a relatively small number of founding individuals who survived the flooding and established themselves on the islands. All of this is consistent with the flooding hypothesis, and it adds a dimension to the story of Scottish island genetic distinctiveness that goes beyond just the ancestral composition. They are distinct not only in which ancestral populations they descend from, but in the particular subset of that ancestry that survived the catastrophe. Their genome is, in a very real sense, shaped by the flood, shaped by the particular combination of individuals who were on high ground when the water came, whose descendants populated the islands and maintained themselves there through the subsequent millennia. There may also be a more literal sense in which the memory of the catastrophe is encoded in the people, not in their genomes directly, but in the stories they tell. We have discussed the Selkie tradition as a possible folk memory of the encounter between sea people and land people, but some of the stories told in the Scottish Islands about the deep sea and the things that come from it, about the strangeness and danger and inexplicable power of the ocean, may encode something even older. A cultural memory, compressed and mythologized almost beyond recognition over 10,000 years of retelling, of the event itself, of the time when the world drowned. Folklorists and scholars of mythology have documented, in many parts of the world, traditions that seem to preserve memories of catastrophic flooding events. The biblical flood narrative is the most familiar to most people, but similar traditions appear in mythologies from Mesopotamia, from India, from indigenous cultures in North and South America, from Polynesia. The widespread distribution of flood mythology has led some researchers to propose that many of these traditions encode genuine memories of the post-glacial sea level rise that affected coastal communities around the world as the last ice age ended. In the specific case of the British Isles and northwestern Europe, the traditions that might encode memories of the Doggerland flooding are harder to identify with confidence because of the multiple layers of subsequent cultural transformation that have overlaid the original material. Celtic mythology arrived in Britain well after the flooding. Norse mythology arrived even later. Whatever stories the Mesolithic survivors of the flooding told, those stories were not written down and have been filtered through many subsequent cultural layers. But fragments may survive. The Celtic traditions of sunken lands, of kingdoms beneath the sea, of the places that once were above water and are now submerged, that appear in Welsh legend as Cantra y Gwaelod, and in Breton tradition as the city of Ys, and in Cornish tradition as Lyonesse, may preserve a cultural memory, however distorted, of genuine coastal inundations that happened during or after the post-glacial sea level rise. These are not necessarily memories of Doggerland specifically. The sea level rise affected coastlines all around the Atlantic and could have generated similar traditions in many communities. But the concentration of these sunken land traditions in exactly the Atlantic fringe communities that show the strongest genetic connection to the ancient coastal populations is worth noting. It is also worth noting that the Scottish island traditions include stories about places that were once above water and are now below it, about submerged structures and drowned settlements that local people remember from the time before. Some of these stories refer to historically documented events, coastal erosion and flooding within the last few centuries. But some of them seem to point to something older, to a time when the sea was not where it is now, when the present coastline was not the coastline there had always been. We cannot verify that these stories encode genuine memories of the Doggerland flooding. The chain of transmission across 10,000 years is too long, the cultural transformations too numerous to allow confident identification of specific events in deep prehistory in present-day folklore. But the convergence of evidence, the genetic bottleneck, the flood-associated mythological traditions, the deep maritime orientation of the communities, all pointing in the same direction, is at least suggestive. The people of the Scottish Islands may be carrying, in both their genes and their stories, the most direct legacy in the world of the catastrophic flooding of Doggerland, the event that ended a world and forced a people onto high ground, the event that, by leaving only a small founding population on the islands, created the genetic pattern that still distinguishes those islands' inhabitants from everyone else in Europe. If there is a memory of that event anywhere in the living human world, it is most likely to be there, in the islands that were the survivors' refuge, in the people who are the survivors' descendants, in the stories that those people have been telling, in one form or another, for as long as they have been here. If you were to drain the North Sea entirely, to remove all the water from the basin between Britain and the European continent, what you would see would be a landscape, a real landscape, with rivers and valleys and hills and what were once forests and grasslands and marshes. You would see the beds of rivers that are now drowned, following the same logic as rivers do today, flowing from higher ground to lower ground, joining tributaries, carving valleys. You would see the outlines of lakes that filled topographic depressions in the ancient landscape. You would see the dunes and beaches of coastlines that no living human has walked on for thousands of years. And if your instruments were sensitive enough, you would see the traces of the people who lived there, the dark patches in the sediment where fires were lit thousands of years ago, leaving charcoal and ash that has been preserved in the anaerobic conditions of the seafloor, the shallow depressions that were once hearths, still visible as discolorations in the stratigraphy, the middens, the accumulations of shells and bones from countless meals, now buried under meters of sediment, but still detectable by the instruments that are increasingly being used to survey the hidden landscape. The study of this hidden landscape is called submerged landscape archaeology, and it is one of the fastest-growing fields in prehistoric research. The technology is advancing rapidly. Multi-beam sonar systems mounted on survey vessels can produce three-dimensional maps of the seafloor with a resolution that reveals features measured in centimeters. Sub-bottom profilers can see through the sediment layers above the ancient land surface to reveal the topography and features of the Mesolithic landscape below. Side-scan sonar can identify areas of unusual hardness or material composition that might indicate archaeological deposits. What these surveys have revealed about the Doggerland landscape is extraordinary. The ancient rivers of Doggerland were large. The main drainage system of the southern North Sea basin in the Mesolithic period included a river, which researchers sometimes call the Ur-Rhine or the Rhine-Thames system, that was among the largest in northwestern Europe. It flowed from what is now the Rhine Delta in the Netherlands across the broad plain of Doggerland and eventually emptied into the Atlantic somewhere to the north of what is now the Orkney Islands. The tributaries of this great river system drained enormous areas. What is now the Thames flowed into it from the west. What is now the modern Rhine joined it from the east. The rivers of eastern England and what is now Denmark contributed their flows. The combined drainage covered hundreds of thousands of square kilometers, and the river valley, where all this water finally came together, was, in the Mesolithic period, one of the most productive freshwater environments in all of northwestern Europe. The fish runs in those ancient rivers would have been spectacular. Salmon moving upriver to spawn, eels migrating between river and sea, pike and perch and bream and roach in the lakes and slower reaches. The seasonal flooding of the valley floor would have created rich wetland habitats, with water birds nesting in their millions and large mammals coming to the river margins to drink. The human communities living in and around this river system had access to a diversity and abundance of food resources that is difficult to overstate. And they left traces. Trawlers working the Dogger Bank, the relatively shallow submarine ridge in the central North Sea that represents the highest ground of the ancient Doggerland landscape, regularly bring up material from the Mesolithic period. Harpoon heads made from antler, barbed points for fishing, flint tools of characteristic Mesolithic types, and bones, animal bones and, occasionally, human bones, eroding from the seafloor sediments and being scooped up by nets dragging across the bottom. One of the most striking finds from the Dogger Bank was a piece of peat that a trawler brought up in the early 20th century. Peat forms in waterlogged, oxygen-poor conditions that prevent the usual decomposition of plant material. The peat from the Dogger Bank was ancient, formed in a landscape that is now 30 meters underwater. When scientists analyzed it, they found preserved plant remains that allowed them to reconstruct what the local vegetation looked like when the peat was forming. Woodland with birch and pine and hazel, a landscape that felt familiar, that looked like the landscapes that still exist in Scotland just a few hundred kilometers to the north. The people who lived in that woodland, who gathered hazelnuts and hunted in the birch forest and fished the rivers of the ancient landscape, were the ancestors of the people who live in Scotland's island communities today. The same species of tree that once grew on the Dogger Bank still grows in the glens of Lewis. The same species of hazel whose nuts preserved in that ancient peat still produces nuts in the hedgerows of Orkney. Something of that ancient landscape, compressed and transformed, persists in the landscapes that the survivors of its flooding colonized. The archaeology of the drowned landscape is not just of academic interest. It is a direct source of information about the people whose genetic legacy has been our subject throughout this story. The bones and tools and hearths that lie under the North Sea are the remains of the people who were there first, the people whose descendants built the stone circles of Orkney and passed their genes down through 10,000 years to the modern communities of the Scottish Islands. Their material remains, inaccessible for most of human history, are now within the reach of technology that did not exist a generation ago. The research that is being done on these submerged sites is important not just for what it tells us about Doggerland, it is important for what it tells us about the people who are its genetic legacy. Every ancient genome extracted from a Dogger Bank context, every hearth mapped by a sub-bottom profiler, every tool identified by a trawler net adds a line to the story that connects the ancient people of the lost landscape to the living people of the surviving islands. The gap between the drowned world and the islands above it is only a few hundred kilometers. In terms of human movement and human memory, that is not very far. The genetic evidence suggests that the gap between the people of Doggerland and the people of the modern Scottish Islands is, in biological terms, even shorter. They are, in some fundamental sense, the same people, separated by catastrophe and time, but connected by blood. That connection is the most remarkable thing in this entire story. That two populations separated by 10,000 years, one of them vanished under the sea, the other still living on the rocks above it, should be so clearly, so measurably, so deeply linked. That the instruments of 21st century science should be able to look at the genomes of living people and see, embedded in them, the genetic legacy of people who fished the rivers of a landscape that is now the floor of the North Sea. History usually requires documents, records, something written or inscribed. The story of Doggerland and its people has no documents. It has only the stones that rose above the water when everything else was flooded, the bones that sank to the seafloor and were preserved in the cold dark, and the living people, in whose cells the information from both those sources has been synthesized and preserved and carried forward into the present. The scientific instruments that can read that information are among the most remarkable achievements of modern research. But the information itself is ancient, far older than the instruments that read it, far older than any written record that exists anywhere in the world. The cells know, they have always known. It has just taken us until now to learn how to listen. And now, as the last images of this journey fade, it is worth sitting for a moment with what the full weight of this story actually means. We began with a cliff and a grey sea, and the particular quality of light on a Hebridean morning. We end there too, because stories that go deep enough always circle back to the landscape that gave them their shape. The cliffs are still there. The sea is still there. The light has not changed in the 10,000 years since the first people watched the water rise around them and found, in the rock above the tide line, a place to stand. The people who stand there now are, in the truest measurable sense we have, the same people, not identical, not unchanged. Changed enormously, in fact, by everything that the centuries brought. New languages, new religions, new economies, new technologies, new political structures, new connections to a world that gets larger and more complicated with every generation. Changed in ways that the people who found the high ground 10,000 years ago could not have imagined and would not have recognized. And yet, the thread has not been broken. The biological connection between the ancient Atlantic shore people and the modern communities of Lewis and Shetland and Orkney is real and measurable and extraordinary. It does not make those modern communities identical to their ancient ancestors. No thread, stretched across 10,000 years and 100 generations of change, is identical at its two ends, but it connects them, binds them, makes them, in some fundamental sense that transcends the usual boundaries of history, part of the same story. That is why the question of why they look different from other Europeans is not merely a curiosity. It is not merely an interesting genetic finding to be added to the database and moved on from. It is a question whose answer opens a window into one of the deepest and least examined chapters of human prehistory in this part of the world. A window onto a world before writing, before metal, before cities, before almost everything we think of as civilization. A world that was rich and complex and fully human in every relevant sense, that produced people who built monuments that still stand and told stories that still echo and maintained communities that are still here. The world they lost is gone. You cannot rebuild Doggerland. You cannot bring back the forests of the Doggerbank, or the rivers that crossed the plain, or the communities that lived in the valley where the Rhine and the Thames once joined. That world is irretrievably gone, preserved only in the sediments and the genomes and the fragments of ancient bone that modern science is patiently learning to read. But the people are not gone. That is the remarkable thing. That is the thing that this entire journey has been pointing toward. The people are not gone. They are here, changed beyond recognition in almost every external sense, speaking a different language and wearing different clothes, and living in different kinds of houses, and participating in a global economy that would be incomprehensible to their Mesolithic ancestors. But here, present, still looking out at the Atlantic from the cliffs of the surviving high ground, still feeling the North Sea wind, still, in some cellular sense that goes all the way down to the molecular architecture of their genomes, recognizing this place as home. Home in a way that goes back further than any memory, further than any story, further than any record of any kind. Home because this is where their people came when the water rose. Home because this is where every generation since has been born and raised and buried. Home because the landscape is written into them, and they are written into the landscape in a relationship that 10,000 years of continuous presence has made as close to permanent as anything in the human world gets. Think about that as you prepare to sleep tonight. Think about what 10,000 years of continuous presence in a single landscape means. Think about what it would feel like to be rooted in a place not just through memory or tradition, but through direct biological descent from the people who were the first to stand on that specific ground. To look at a cliff face and know, at some level beneath conscious thought, that this exact landscape was what your ancestors saw when the world ended and they found their refuge. To feel the wind off the Atlantic and have that wind mean something that no visitor, however sympathetic, however attentive, could fully access. The people of the Scottish Islands carry that knowledge in their bodies, even if they do not always know that is what they carry. It is in the frequency distributions of their genome, in the architecture of their faces, in the particular quality of their relationship to the sea and the rock and the sky. It is in the stories they tell, and the music they make, and the language, if it survives, that they speak. It is old, this knowledge. Older than anything that can be written down or consciously transmitted, older than the traditions that encode it. As old as the people themselves, who are as old as the catastrophe that made them, which is to say, as old as the end of the world that came before this one. Sleep now. The story is as long as the landscape is old, and the landscape is very old indeed. The telling has only scratched the surface. There are things about this story that will not be known until technologies are developed that do not yet exist, until questions are asked that have not yet been formulated, until researchers look at evidence that is still lying under the seafloor or buried in the earth or hidden in the genomes of living people who have not yet had their DNA sampled. The story continues. It always has. The thread did not break when the world drowned. It will not break now. Rest well. The sea is still there. The cliffs are still standing. And somewhere on the highest ground of the Atlantic's edge, the oldest people in Europe are watching the same sky that their ancestors watched when they climbed up out of the water and decided to stay. They are still here. And now, in the quiet dark, so are you. Roughly 2,500 years ago, a new technology arrived in Scotland that would leave one of the most distinctive marks on the physical landscape of the islands. Not farming, which had been established for millennia. Not metal, which had arrived in the Bronze Age. Something different. A new form of stone architecture that is found almost nowhere else in the world, a building tradition so specific to the Atlantic fringe of Scotland that it might as well be a genetic marker, as distinctive in its own way as the ancient haplogroups we have been discussing. The broch. A broch is a circular dry stone tower, typically between 10 and 15 meters in diameter at the base and originally reaching heights of perhaps 10 to 15 meters or more. The walls are extraordinarily thick, often 3 or 4 meters at the base, and hollow, containing internal galleries and stairways between the inner and outer skins. The construction technique is remarkable, using interlocking and corbelled stone courses to achieve heights and internal complexity that should not, in theory, be achievable with dry stone construction, without mortar, without any binding agent, beyond the careful selection and placement of stones. There are hundreds of brochs in Scotland, and they are concentrated almost exclusively in the north and west. Shetland, Orkney, the Western Isles, the Highland mainland, the Caithness coast. The distribution is strikingly coincident with the areas we have been discussing throughout this story, the areas of highest ancient genetic ancestry, the areas of deepest continuous human occupation, the areas most resistant to the demographic waves that swept across most of the British Isles in the Neolithic and Bronze Age periods. Who built the brochs? Why? These are questions that archaeologists have been asking for a long time, and the answers that have emerged are more interesting than the original simple versions. The conventional answer, which is still broadly accepted, is that the brochs were built as defensible residences in a period of increasing social complexity and competition. The Iron Age across Europe was a time of greater social stratification and more organized violence than the earlier periods. Hill forts and other defensible structures appear across Britain and Europe in this period. The broch, in the Scottish interpretation, is the local, specifically northern solution to the same problem of defense and status display. But the brochs are not just functional defensive structures. They are also extraordinary feats of engineering and architectural skill, and they seem to represent a very rapid flowering of a specific architectural tradition. The earliest brochs, dating to around 400 BC, are already sophisticated. There was no obvious crude precursor phase of proto-brochs gradually evolving toward the final form. The tradition seems to appear at something close to its full development, which implies either a very rapid period of innovation or the arrival of a skilled architectural tradition from somewhere. Where that architectural knowledge came from is still debated. Some researchers have suggested connections to the Atlantic megalithic tradition, seeing the broch as a local evolution of the corbelled chamber construction techniques developed for Neolithic tombs like Maeshowe. Others have looked for external parallels, finding structural similarities to certain Mediterranean towers in Sardinia, the Nuraghi, and in the Balearic Islands, though the connection, if any, remains unclear. What is not debated is that the broch builders were, genetically, the descendants of the populations we have been discussing throughout this story. The ancient DNA from broch contexts in Scotland, where it has been analysed, shows the same ancestral composition as earlier Scottish populations, with the familiar, elevated, ancient European hunter-gatherer component and the lower-than-average steppe ancestry that characterises the Atlantic fringe. The broch builders were not newcomers. They were the people who had been here all along, expressing their deep architectural intelligence in a new and extraordinarily ambitious form. The brochs were not just towers. They were, in some sense, statements. Statements about permanence, about the capacity to master stone, about the ambition to create something that would last. They are, in their way, continuous with the great stone circles of the Neolithic, different in form and function, but similar in their expression of the impulse to shape the landscape in a way that asserts human presence and permanence. When you visit a ruined broch today, standing in the wind on some exposed Shetland promontory or inside the dramatic circular interior of Duncarloway on Lewis, you are standing inside a building that was constructed by people who were the direct genetic ancestors of the modern island communities, not in a general European sense, in a specific, local, biologically continuous sense. The people who shaped those stones, who selected each course, who built up those impossible dry stone walls to heights that the subsequent centuries have eroded but not entirely defeated, those people are the great-great-great-grandparents, with enough greats that the number loses meaning, of the people who live near those ruins today. The brochs are family history, made of stone, and they last. Unlike the wooden houses and the leather boats and the woven clothing and the accumulated knowledge that the Iron Age communities of the Scottish Islands possessed, the brochs last. 2,000 years after they were built, some of them are still standing to significant heights, their walls still carrying the interlocked stone courses that their builders set in place without mortar or metal or machinery. They are the most durable record that the Iron Age communities of the Scottish Islands left behind. But the most durable record of all, more durable than any stone, is the biological one. The genetic inheritance that passes from parent to child, copied and recopied with extraordinary fidelity through every generation since the first people found the high ground when the world was drowning. The broch walls are impressive. The genome is extraordinary. Both speak to the same deep-rooted human impulse, to build something that will last, to assert continuity against the erosion of time. The people who built the brochs are not remembered by name. No historical source records their identities, their achievements, their stories. They lived in a world without writing, without the kind of documentary tradition that allows individual people to be known across the centuries. They are anonymous, as most people in all of human history are anonymous. Their names are not recorded anywhere, but their buildings are still standing, and their genes are still circulating. In both of those senses, they are still here. Not as individuals, not as persons with memories and faces and stories that we can access, but as presence, as the builders whose work has outlasted every attempt of time to erase it, in stone and in blood. That is, in its own way, a kind of immortality, not the immortality of fame or of remembered story, the older, quieter, more durable immortality of continuation, of being part of a chain that does not break, of passing something on that survives. The broch builders passed it on. The chain held. 10,000 years after Doggerland drowned, the most ancient ancestry in Europe still lives in the people who live near the ruins of the towers. Their Iron Age ancestors built in the same landscape where their Neolithic ancestors raised their stone circles, and their Mesolithic ancestors found their refuge from the rising sea. It is a remarkable thing, probably the most remarkable thing in this entire story, which contains many remarkable things, that the thread held, that the chain did not break, that the people are still here, on the same ground, under the same sky, looking out at the same sea that took so much from their ancestors and left them only the high ground. They are still here. And that, finally, is the real answer to the question we began with. The islanders of Scotland look different from every other European because they are, in a specific and measurable biological sense, the oldest Europeans. Not in the crude nationalist or racial sense that such claims have historically been corrupted to serve, but in the straightforward, scientifically grounded sense that the proportion of their genome that derives from the people who were here first, from the ancient Atlantic populations that preceded the farming revolution and largely survived it in this one specific corner of the continent, is higher than anywhere else in Europe. They carry more of the deep past in their cells than anyone else, and that past shows, in ways that careful measurement can detect, and that a less careful but more intuitive form of perception has always been able to feel. It shows in their genetic data. It shows in their physical characteristics. It shows in their relationship to the landscape that has been their home for 10,000 years. It shows in the stories they tell and the music they make and the language, however precarious, that they maintain. It shows in the faces that have been watching the Atlantic for longer than almost any human faces anywhere have been watching any particular piece of the world. We have returned, more than once in this journey, to the subject of the Gaelic language. It is worth giving it a fuller treatment than we have managed so far, because language is not merely a cultural artifact, it is an archive. A living, speaking, breathing archive that carries information in its structures and its vocabulary and its patterns of sound that no other kind of evidence can provide. And Gaelic, the particular Gaelic that is still spoken in the Scottish Islands, is an archive with unusual depth, unusual complexity, and an unusual concentration of the oldest available material. Scottish Gaelic is a member of the Goidelic branch of the Celtic language family, closely related to Irish and Manx, more distantly related to the Brittonic languages of Wales and Cornwall and Brittany. It arrived in Scotland from Ireland in the early medieval period, brought by settlers from the Irish kingdom of Dalriata, who established communities on the western Scottish coast and islands beginning around the 5th and 6th centuries of the Common Era. This is not ancient, by the standards of the deep history we have been discussing. 5th century AD is very recent compared to the Neolithic and Mesolithic layers we have spent most of our time in. But language and people are not the same thing. When the Irish settlers arrived, and their Gaelic speech gradually displaced whatever was spoken before, they were not replacing the existing population entirely. As we have established through the genetic evidence, the people of the Scottish Islands absorbed the new arrivals rather than being replaced by them. The genetic continuity is clear. What was replaced, or substantially replaced, was the language. The new arrivals spoke Gaelic, and over time, through the usual processes of language shift in contact situations, the existing population adopted Gaelic as well. When a population adopts a new language, however, the adoption is never complete. The old language influences the new one. Words for things that the old language had names for, and the new language did not, are often borrowed from the old language into the new one. Grammatical patterns from the old language are imposed onto the new one by speakers who are still thinking partly in the old way. Sounds from the old language that do not exist in the new one create the distinctive phonology of regional dialects that speakers of the prestige variety of the language sometimes find difficult to understand. Scottish Gaelic shows all of these signs of contact with an older linguistic substrate. It is phonologically distinct from Irish Gaelic in ways that go beyond the usual range of dialectal variation between languages of the same family. It has grammatical features that do not have clear parallels in the other Celtic languages, and that some researchers have attributed to influence from the pre-Gaelic language of Scotland. It has vocabulary items, particularly for landscape features, for sea conditions, for specific aspects of the natural environment that differ from Irish equivalents and that sometimes resist clear Celtic etymology. These differences are not all attributable to the substrate, of course. Some of them reflect independent development of the language in its new environment. Some reflect Norse influence during the Viking period. Some reflect simply the ordinary processes of linguistic change operating differently in Scotland than in Ireland over 15 centuries. But some of them, the ones that resist explanation from these other sources, point toward something older, toward the language or languages that were spoken in the Scottish Islands before Gaelic arrived, and that, in their death, left traces in the language that displaced them. What language was that? As we have discussed, we do not know. The Pictish inscriptions give us some material, but not enough to characterize a complete language. The place name evidence gives us additional material, but place names are a notoriously difficult source for linguistic analysis. We can say that the pre-Gaelic language of Scotland was not Gaelic, not Latin, not Norse, and not, as far as we can determine, any language that survives today in recognizable form. It was something else. Something that belongs to the blank on the linguistic map of pre-Celtic Europe. But the Gaelic that replaced it carries the impression of it, like a fossil in stone. The sounds of the old language, modified and filtered through the new language's phonology. The grammatical patterns of the old language, adapted and incorporated into the structures of the new one. The words for things that only the old language had words for, preserved in Gaelic as borrowings or loan translations that no longer connect to a living source. Gaelic is also, in a more obvious way, an archive of the landscape of the Scottish Islands. The specific vocabulary that Scottish Gaelic has developed for the features of the island landscape, for the sea conditions, for the weather patterns, for the plants and animals and geological features, is an extraordinary record of sustained observation. The language has words for distinctions that other languages do not need to make, distinctions that arise from a relationship with a specific environment that is, in some cases, thousands of years deep. The vocabulary for sea conditions in Scottish Gaelic is famously rich. There are words for the sea in specific states of wind and tide and swell that have no equivalents in English, not because English lacks the cognitive capacity to describe those conditions, but because English-speaking communities have not spent enough time in those specific seas, observing those specific conditions, to need the distinctions. The Gaelic vocabulary for sea states is the product of uncounted generations of fishermen and sailors and coastal dwellers, observing the water around them with the kind of close attention that comes from depending on it. That vocabulary is not just poetically interesting, it is practically useful. A fisherman who has the words for the distinctions knows things that a fisherman who only has approximate descriptions does not. The language itself is a form of expertise, encoding the distinctions that matter and preserving them for the next generation who will need them. This is why the loss of Gaelic is not merely a cultural loss, it is a practical loss. The language carries information that is not fully translatable into English. Not because the concepts are inaccessible, but because the English vocabulary for those concepts is too coarse to preserve the distinctions that Gaelic makes. When Gaelic is lost, those distinctions are lost. The knowledge they encode, accumulated over millennia of intimate relationship with a specific landscape, becomes inaccessible. The people who speak Gaelic today are therefore, in a very practical sense, the custodians of an archive that they did not choose to become custodians of, that was handed to them by the circumstances of their birth in a specific community, in a specific place, but that they carry nonetheless. And like all archivists, they face the question of whether the archive will outlast them. The answer, at the moment, is uncertain. The number of Gaelic speakers is small and declining. Sleep well, the thread holds. The ancient roots of these islands run deeper than any language, any tradition,